Hello, viewers. Welcome to Canada Bangladesh Social Justice Action Research Alliance. On this platform, we talk about many issues that impact social justice issues locally and globally. Today with us, I'm extremely excited and privileged to have with us Professor Hans Skott-Myhre. I have met Hans when I went to Canada for my master's in social justice and equity studies, and I have learned a lot from Hans, about youth work, and particularly in ways that helped me tremendously is that my own practices I've been involved with in youth for a long time. If I remember correctly, I do remember correctly. I started working in 1999, right after my high school when I got into university. So it's been almost 20 years doing youth work. So in our capacity, a lot of our audience actually know what we do. So we promote critical literacy across country. We work with the marginalized youth and children and actually find out ways to build capacity for them to find work, and then also how we can create a consciousness, political consciousness, to take part in social processes. So today we will discuss exactly about neoliberalization of academia and global capitalism. And because academia, education literacy is what we do, it's very important for us to understand the politics of academia and the how global capitalism is connected to it. So Hans, thank you very much for taking some time to be on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans. Now, before entering into the main conversation, how do we define neoliberalization of academia to audience that are not academic? And how would you explain this to somebody over a cup of coffee, outside the academic circle?
So a couple of things to think about. One, historically, sort of a trajectory, the way it's moved across time, and the other is contemporary. And so in order to understand neoliberalism, you've got capitalism, global capitalism in the title as well. In order to understand neoliberalism, you have to understand capital. And so we get capitalism shortly after mercantilism during the colonial period. And what capitalism is in really, really simple terms, and of course it's a quite complicated process with lots and lots of bits and pieces to it, but to talk about it in the simplest sort of terms, what we need to understand is that capital is profit. And so capitalism is a system that functions to create profit. Now, what is profit? So profit is an excess. So in the case of capitalism, that's an excess of money. So in order to have an excess of money, in order to have a capitalist system, you have to be able to translate material living activity into an abstract symbol, which is money. And so step one, you have to be able to get people to work for you, either by force or by indoctrinating them so that they think that they need to work for you in order to survive. And you need to have them work for you in such a way that you give them this symbolic value called money, which of course doesn't actually exist, right? So of course you can have a quarter or a rupee or a dollar or a euro, and they have a material form, at least in a lot of places they do, although we have increasingly, for example, in the United States right now, moves towards cashless economies in which you actually won't have a material object and be purely virtual. But to return to what I was saying, so you have this symbolic exchange in which I give you this thing called money in exchange for you doing something on my behalf or for me. If I give you slightly less than I can sell the thing you create for me for, then I have profit. I have an excess. So in order to do that, I need to somehow convince you that I get to be in charge of what Marx called the means of production. That is to say, I need to be in charge of however we're going to produce the thing that you're going to do, right? So I'm in charge of your labor. That is to say, your labor now belongs to me because I control, for example, the buildings or the machines or the land or any of these sorts of things that you use in order to produce the thing that you make. And then because I now own your place of business, if you will, or the space in which you make things, I get to control how much I say what you do is worth. And if I do it well as a capitalist, then I end up giving you actually less than what your labor is worth, so that I can have profit or capital at the end of the day. So capitalism, as we understand it, wouldn't be possible were it not for colonialism. And so in order for there to be an adequate amount of excess wealth, you have to be able to get large numbers of people to give you their labor essentially for free, right? This is what Marx called primitive accumulation, the first step in accumulating profit. And the colonial period did this by essentially stealing things, right? So Europeans went all across the world and they essentially stole land and they stole material things and they stole machinery and they stole people, literally. And so to a large degree, for example, capitalism, which prompted the European project of capitalism, wouldn't have been possible if you hadn't enslaved millions of Africans who worked essentially for free in the United States and throughout the Americas, actually. And as a result of which you essentially were getting all of that for free, so it was pure profit, essentially pure profit, because what you paid for the human beings involved was a minimal amount. So they become literally expendable modes of production. They become bits and pieces in the mode of production. And of course, this happens all across the world as well, right? In India or Bangladesh or China or Japan or Africa, Central and South America, Australia, human beings and their material existence become only important to capitalists to the degree that they can be used in order to generate profit. Okay, so with me so far? Okay, so
Absolutely.
So in order for capitalism to expand, then, it needs to continually generate this cycle of profit. It needs to keep money in circulation as broadly and as widely as it possibly can, and it needs to continue to convince people that it is reasonable to take their labor from them and give them something in exchange for it that is utterly abstract. Now, there are two things to think about there. One is that because money is absolutely abstract, it means that its value is highly variable. Now, there have been attempts to tie it to various concrete things, gold, silver, et cetera, and so forth. But generally speaking, particularly as we get into the latter part of the 20th century, money is worth whatever the folks in charge say it's worth. And so it really doesn't have any longer any particular value. And it is set up in really, really, really complex systems with computers and so forth, so that it generates its own sense of value out of the way that it circulates within a completely abstract framework of virtual reality. That is to say, within an exchange of global computers that extends across the world completely and works, these supercomputers now work at such a speed that no matter what the trade is, no matter what the particular material exchange or the particular set of values is, it always profits, always profits. And what that means is that because the majority of us don't have access to these sorts of things, capitalism now is fully and pretty much totally operated, but it's always been operated to the benefit of the capitalist. But now it operates with increasingly less utility for both the material world, that is to say the ecological world, animals, plants, et cetera, and so forth, in which we are embedded, whether we want to think about it that way or not. Pandemic being certainly an example of the ways in which that's gotten out of control. But also, the way that labor is now constructed, it is materially less advantageous to people who are not capitalists in terms of their ability to earn a living and sustain themselves. Okay, so what does that have to do with neoliberalism? So under initial forms of capitalism, the sort of thinking was that there was sort of some kind of balance between labor and material needs of people and the generation of capitalism. And that under capitalism, there would be some moderation of its most vicious effects, sort of a balancing out, if you will, when it was put against the logic of material well-being. So, for example, you have labor unions that begin to fight for a certain working less hours, or making a bit more money, or having a bit more control over the means of production. And this goes on globally, right? This is a problem for capital, in that suddenly it has to accommodate less profit. It has to be able to build in negotiations. And what it does is it assimilates unions into its machinery in such a way that actually over time unions become less efficacious and eventually are sort of broken and withered away to a much lesser degree. So we have far less bargaining power than we used to have at a global level, as well as at a national level. But something else happens, and it really begins in the late 60s, the latter part of the 20th century, and that is that we suddenly begin to get computers into the game. And in 1968, we have the first computer that can think faster and compute faster than a human being. And that is a game changer. Because what happens is that capitalism takes computers as a mode of production and begins to apply it to pretty much everything. And as computers are applied to everything, its ability to maneuver abstractly, that is to say, to shift money from this place to that place, to open modes of production in ways they couldn't before because they could communicate across countries and national boundaries. So you get the ability to move industry all around the world because you can keep in touch through computers for the very first time. It's instantaneous. You can open a warehouse and fill it with goods, and then if that's not working, you can instantaneously shut it down and move somewhere else. And so computers open up an entirely new realm in which capital becomes working first at abstracting all of its capacities, but secondarily to begin to need human beings less. And so, of course, in industrial capitalism, human beings were an integral part of the means of production. They worked in factories, they were managers, they did all of these sorts of things. But as we get into the 90s, and certainly as we get into the 21st century, robots have begun to replace huge sectors of the industrial economy. And we begin to get the ability to virtually do almost every task a human being can do. So you can go to certain McDonald's in certain places in the world now, and a computer has the capacity to cook your burger to your order and to serve it to you without any human beings being involved at all. Many auto plants now are also almost fully roboticized. So you go from workforces in a factory that used to be tens of thousands of people down to 30 technicians that are keeping the computers running. Okay, so what that means is that we have to have a different kind of a logic around capitalism. Capitalism can't be built on a logic that is interested any longer in human beings as a central part of its mode of production. So in the 90s, we begin to get this idea, which is called neoliberalism, which is that what will drive the logic of our societies is not the material needs of the living people in it, but what is called the market forces. That is to say, what's important for us about how we organize society is not the people in it or whether their needs are being met, but whether the economy is doing well. And so neoliberalism in the simplest terms is to say, what's important is the economy. That is to say, what's important is the abstract system that encompasses the globe, that produces profit and manages money. And what's important for human beings is how well they fit into the economic system. Not whether their material needs are being met, not whether their health is good, not whether their happiness is attended to, not whether they're capable of managing their social affairs. What becomes important is how well they can integrate into economics, into the economic system. And so neoliberalism in the simple sense then is to say, what should drive our society, what we should pay attention to is the market, that is to say the economic system. And that should be the first thing. And just to give you a really sort of silly example of that, when I was coming up, which of course was a million years ago now, when you read the paper, you never saw, or listened to the news, you never saw any reference to the stock market. It was way in the back pages of the newspaper, and it was very seldom mentioned unless there was some sort of crisis on the news. No one referred to the economy on a regular basis. Nowadays, every single news story references the economy. The stock market is treated as though we're a human being that does well or does poorly, it's sick, it's healthy. So what's become predominant for us ideologically, or in terms of how we think about things, is that we think about ourselves as economic agents, not as human agents, not as human beings in material relations with one another, but as economic agents. Gilles Deleuze, the French philosopher, says that we move from being individuals to being individuals. That is to say, he says that we cease to be functioning in terms of our human material relations and start to function as niche markets. That is to say, how can we be deployed economically? In what ways can we be used to further the stock market? In what ways can we be used to make sure that the businesses are doing well? In what ways can we be used to make sure that there's lots of money in circulation? And that becomes our primary function. Now, some people would say, well, what we've really become is consumers, that what neoliberalism does is define us essentially as people who buy things rather than people who do things. And that was certainly perhaps true in the latter part of the 20th century. What's even more frightening now about neoliberalism is that we're not even needed as consumers that much any longer. The stock market is capable of generating adequate wealth on its own without direct reference to the material commodities that we're producing. That's sort of a nice side game, but the real money is in things called hedge funds, and hedge funds are basically betting on the market. Whether it goes up or goes down, it doesn't matter. It can make money, makes money. And if you have a sufficient amount of money, your money will make money without reference to the rest of the planet, the rest of the human beings and other living things on it. And so in a degree, what we've done is separated the capitalist class from the rest of the world in terms of the necessity for us. And so what's changed is where we were used to be necessary to the capitalist class in terms of at least buying things, if not producing things, I would argue that probably right now, they don't really need us much at all. What is mostly troubling about us is when we cause trouble, when we cause ruckus, when we resist, when we rebel. But in terms of any positive activity that we can be engaged in, they really don't need us any longer. And okay, so I say they is a tricky business because, of course, there is no men or women sitting in a back room somewhere plotting all of this. It's a certain kind of logic. Right? It's a certain way of thinking about things that leads inevitably to. But this kind of logic, right, is just as addictive for the capitalist. In other words, they're inducted into thinking this way. It isn't that they're inherently evil, pernicious people who are trying to harm folks. It's that it's a system they can take advantage of and becomes addictive in terms of wanting more and more and more power, money, wealth, privilege, et cetera, and so forth. So in a sense, there's no they. It's an it. And that it is a capitalist logic. Niklas Luhmann, the great sociologist, said that society really runs independently of human intentions. It has certain logics, and those logics tend to play themselves out. And certain logics are in competition with other logics for how much of society they can compose. But society itself is indifferent to human beings in the way that ecology is indifferent to human beings. It's just a way of organizing things that has a certain logic to it. So neoliberalism in that sense then, as we see it now, or as it's coming into being now, is this way of inducting people into believing that what's the most important thing in society is money and the economy. And making sure that people are addicted to money and that money becomes the most important and primary motivation for their life. Now, okay, one other thing real quickly that's actually really important is as we get into the 21st century, because the world of production changes significantly from industrial capitalism, which was producing goods and services and human beings were engaged in that, to a system in which, yes, goods and services are still produced and some human beings are engaged in that. But it isn't the tendency of society any longer to engage human beings as producers of things. What becomes far more important is human beings as producers of social life. That is, our ability to think, our ability to engage in social activity, and our ability to think abstractly and creatively. Because we move from an industrial economy in which factories are producing things to a virtual economy in which computers and the virtual world is producing things. Social media, of course, is the most profitable thing on the planet. It makes more money than almost anything. Entertainment, similarly. And so what capitalism is interested in is as workers, if you will, now, is what Antonio Negri calls social workers. And I don't mean social workers like in the United States, people who go out and help people. I mean workers of the social. That is to say that the economy is now interested in our very capacity to interact with one another, our desires. And so it wants us engaged in the virtual world. It wants us engaged on social media. It wants us engaged in symbolism. It wants us engaged in creativity. And so it's much more focused now on abstractly inducting us into the system of economy than in concretely inducting us into the system of economy. Now, of course, that's not to say there aren't people who are doing concrete things. Of course there are. But that's not where the real money is. The real money for capital is in our very desires, the things we want. And so it produces an endless array of things that we want, but of course never provides access to the actual completion of that desire, which means that we're constantly in a frustrated cycle of being presented with things we should desire, ways to be, endless programs for self-improvement, endless programs for degrees, endless programs for certificates, endless programs of further education, endless programs of weight loss, endless programs of relationship counseling, endless programs of get a new mortgage, buy a new house, get a new car, et cetera, and so forth, not as modes of consumption, because it's actually set up in such a way that none of those processes can ever complete. And so for example, as a student, what's most important about your education is not actually what you learn, but how much debt you accrue. Because in having you accrue massive amounts of debt, you get inducted into the economic system in ways that become increasingly difficult for you to extricate yourself from. You are essentially a slave to the economic system by debt. And of course, the entire society now has debts, credit cards, credit lines, but student loans are an immense amount of debt globally, billions and billions and billions of dollars in profit, right? Health, by the way, similarly. And so if you can induct an entire group of people into debt, you've essentially enslaved them because they now have to operate according to your rules and your logic, and they have to dictate their lives and structure their lives in such a way as to attempt to recoup that debt regardless of what they really want to do. And so what this does is set up a whole group of people as both addicted to the economy, that is to say, you know, it's sort of like an addict. So when an addict first uses a drug, it's kind of fun and sort of pleasurable. And matter of fact, if you're an addict, you really like it. And then you continue to take it. But gradually over time, you never really get that first high back again. Instead, what you get is to the very end that you're only taking the drug to keep from getting sick. In other words, you're not really getting pleasure from it. You just know that if you don't take the drug, you'll become really, really, really sick. Well, similarly with our engagement with the capitalism and the economy, we now are engaged in debt and with capitalism in such a way that, you know, the first job you get, the first little bit of money, your first credit card is kind of, oh, this is really cool. I can I can go to school, it's lovely. By the time you're late 20s, early 30s, and certainly 40 in today's economy, you're simply working to keep from getting sick. You're terrified of falling out of the economy. You're terrified of becoming homeless. You're terrified of not being able to provide for your family. You're terrified that the economy will move beyond you, that your skill set will no longer function. And so you're produced as a lacking subject. That is to say, all of this amazing creative force that human beings have, this ability to live and create and love and be artistic and be musical and engage in producing food and producing things, all of that remarkable, creative, intensive, loving, relational force is subjugated to and erased by an addiction to an abstraction in such a way that you don't do much of any of the things that I just talked about. And you don't understand it. You don't know why you're depressed. You're not sure why you're anxious. You're not sure why your relationships don't really function. You're not sure why you can't build the relationships with the children that you want. You're not sure why you don't really feel connected to your community. You're not sure why the education that you're getting really doesn't resonate with you at a really deep level. You're not sure why your capacity to love and to feel loved is essentially not really available to you. And it's largely because you're living in what Jean Baudrillard talked about as simulacra. That is to say, you're not really living your life, you're living a copy of your life. And that copy of your life isn't satisfying. It doesn't really get you. Gilles Deleuze talks about it as a society of indefinite postponement. That is to say, you never, ever, ever arrive. You never get there. You know, your first marriage is just prelude to your divorce and your second marriage. Your education degree is only useful for a while, and then things have moved on and you need a new certificate, a different degree. They promised that when you got a degree, you would get a job, but then there really aren't those jobs out there anymore. And so neoliberalism gives you this idea that it's your fault. And it's your fault individually because you somehow have failed to have the requisite requirements that would allow you to live a fully and satisfying life, which of course is portrayed by capitalists flying around and, you know, having parties and owning $1 million yachts. And so there's this lottery phenomenon, which is, you know, you could win the lottery too if you were just, you know, smart enough, lucky enough, brave enough, courageous enough, self-actualized enough, empowered enough, then you too could win the lottery. So why aren't you doing those things? What's wrong with you that you're not doing that? So then you get the other explanations, which are, well, you know, okay, so we're going to acknowledge racism, sexism, gender, homophobia, all of these sorts of things as being impediments to your ability to climb the ladder. But if we remove them, then everything will be great. Once we get rid of those things, then capitalism will function properly, and you too will be a corporate executive. You too will be a millionaire. You too will be a billionaire. We just get rid of these things, these social problems that are left over from industrial capitalism and earlier periods of slavery and so forth and so on. And of course, that's nonsense as well, because they don't mean to remove them. They only mean to remove the symbols. That is to say, symbolic racism. Because, I mean, if you think about the logic, if we removed all of those things and everyone now had access to all that is promised, because there's no more racism, there's no more sexism, there's no more homophobia, there's no more gendered discrimination. Wow. That means there would be billions and billions and billions and billions of millionaires. And of course, that's obviously ridiculous. The economy could never sustain that. That would never happen, right? In fact, the opposite is happening. While we're removing, quote unquote, these impediments to our social growth, which, by the way, I'm entirely in favor of. I think it's absolutely fantastic. We should get rid of those things. They're incredibly harmful and painful and dangerous and difficult and damaging and traumatic to people. Absolutely, they should go. But if we think that when they go, capitalism will suddenly become a paradigm, then we're not accounting for the absolute brutality of capitalism as a system that will always value money over life. Because it's not because it's a nasty or bad or immoral system, but because it's its nature. It's the way that it works. So is that helpful in terms of understanding?
Yeah, absolutely. I have so many questions, like, based on, what we're saying. So one of the things that you were mentioning is that now what capitalism is interested in our desire, in our relationship. I think Shoshana Zuboff, in her latest book, that Surveillance Capitalism, has done a wonderful, phenomenal job. Is that each and every single interaction that we do are essentially a way of extracting surplus. So it's not essentially the digital; it's the logic behind that digital that is destroying humanity. And it's interesting, in that book, I think in fourth and fifth chapter, she brings something that is scary, is that me as an individual, I have the ability, that will to will, but with the rise of artificial intelligence and machine learning, the amount of data that I'm exhausting, my existence, the amount of data it has on me, it just pretty much not only has the ability to manipulate me, and it also has the ability to take away my will to will, and therefore I am produced. Not I'm essentially I am the way I'm thinking. You and I had a conversation at Brock, is that the converse, what does it mean to be educated? What is education? As long as there's life, there is education. So you said something that it is always something that is evolving and then collapsing and then evolving. So we are never just like something defined. But what is happening and you were mentioning that I don't know why you mentioned about Gilles Deleuze's indefinite indefinite, that I always have to get smarter, faster, richer, more educated, and all of that. I think Eric Fromm has also talked about this unconscious depression. Is that I go to a party, I'm supposed to be happy, but I am not happy. I'm supposed to be fulfilled, but I'm not fulfilled. I think it's Ruth Wilson in her book, Golden Gulag. She talks about a thing called racial capitalism. Is that capitalism always operates on inequality. So and that's, you mentioned about colonialism and its connection to capitalism. I mean, I think not before going to Brock, I always was confused about this idea that basically what comes before what. Was it capitalism or was it colonialism? What is bringing all this havoc? So Ruth Wilson tells in her book is that capitalism operates on inequality. It's actually a relationship, and racism enshrines that unequal relationship to extract profit and reducing us to that. Now, you have mentioned something incredibly important, and I really want you to speak to that. Two point. One point is that our need for existence is entirely for economy. We're no longer human beings. It's sort of like something that is playing in my head is human buying. Can I buy? Therefore, I exist. So it's like almost like, that I think therefore I am, I buy, therefore I am, am I actually buying something, right? Am I a consumer? So when we didn't have fourth industrial revolution, capitalism were relatively little slow to move from one place to another place. But now, as you have mentioned about the stock market and the computerization of stock market, is that how in a matter of a second billions can be gone. We have learned about flash crash, in United States, in the New York Stock Exchange. In Australia, there was like all of a sudden, people owed over $1 billion, just because the computer decided. So, and also in the age of algorithm. So what is something incredibly scary is that in the after the industrial revolution, human beings were needed even for producing. Well, they were protesting, they were demanding higher wages, but at least they were needed. But now we are in the system where the system does not essentially need to depend on human beings. So it's far worse, that Harari says in her book, is that far worse than exploitation. It's the irrelevance. Mm-hmm. So how do we deal with these two elements? The fast capacity of computerized capitalism, I call it in my own term computational colonialism, is that computerized capacity of capitalism's very fast ability to move from one place to another place. Talk about Amazon, talk about all the other tech giants like WhatsApp. When it was sold for almost like $22 billion, they had 55 employees. Think about General Motors, the amount of employees they had when they had that kind of success, right? So that is mind-boggling. And I am sitting talking to you from Bangladesh in a village, and I am very heavily engaged with my community. And as an educator, when I talk to these young people, I am often at a loss. I'm not apologizing. I'm not, assuming any superior position. I just don't know how to explain. It's so complicated. So how do you deal with these two things? Fast capacity of capitalism, powered by computing capacity to move, and our existence as human beings to be relevant. Way worse than exploitation, irrelevance. How do you deal with that?
Okay, so two things to think about. One is that capitalism always inadvertently sets up its own demise. For example, when it set up industry, when it set up factories, it gathered people who had been living in rural situations all across Europe, who were completely unable to talk to one another because the miles between them were not able to be brought together. So it's really quite difficult to raise rebellions or resistance to monarchies and so forth. Only the middle class, the bourgeoisie, the knights and the earls and the dukes were able to mount revolutions. Hence the Magna Carta, for example, which was not rural peasants. It was, in fact, the emerging middle class. That had the first revolutions. The second revolutions. The first revolutions were actually peasant revolutions all across Europe as they began to try to take away their land. We'll leave that aside. It's really important history, but not pertinent here. So when they brought these folks together in factories, what they inadvertently did was to bring together a whole lot of people they had dislocated and disenfranchised and stole land from, and put them in close proximity to one another. What that meant was these people could begin to organize, and they could begin to share experiences, and they could begin to talk about what was happening to them. And as a result of which they began to organize unions, and the rest is history. Now, capitalism didn't mean to do that when it set up the factories. That wasn't their intention. Their intention was to control, discipline, and put people in the mode of production in ways that they could manage and control. They inadvertently set up the very mechanisms by which industrial capitalism eventually became incredibly difficult for capitalism to manage, and it found its way out through virtuality. That was how it was able to step outside the realm of unions and material organizing. Was they were able to offshore, they were able to do different things that broke up this sort of communal capacity, community capacity of labor when it was concentrated in factories. That's not dissimilar now. What capital has been incredibly successful at doing, but not for very long, and that's very important to remember, that capitalism is still emerging as a 21st century virtual system. It isn't set in stone by any stretch of the imagination. And so what it's doing now is it understands that it is organizing people as outside of itself. In other words, irrelevant, yes. But what that really means is that we don't belong to the economic system in the way that capitalism has told us we would. That is to say, capitalism can't do what it promises to do, which is to give us a good life, to allow us to make more money, or to allow us to have the money to buy the things we need. In other words, the idea of progress within capitalism is failing. Now, there are a couple of ways that could end up. One is capitalism could say, wow, well, that didn't work the way we thought. We better restructure. And maybe money isn't such a good idea. That's unlikely to happen, right? I mean, it's quite unlikely capitalism will one day say, oh, gee, this system doesn't really work for most people, so we'll give it up. What's more likely is that capitalism will attempt to convince us that it is working, and that somehow we're irrelevant and it's our fault. We're not irrelevant. We're the only relevant thing here. You can't belong to an abstract system. That's not possible, because it doesn't care about you. It has absolutely no regard for you. It's like trying to belong. I love this when people say, I love the organization I work for. There's no such thing as the organization. There's no thing to love. I love my university, There's no such thing as the university. There's no such thing as the economy. It doesn't exist. You can't belong to it. You can't love it. It can't love you back. And it can't give you what you need in order to survive well. So what capitalism then has to do is what it's always done, which is to try to convince people that, in fact, it's working, you're not working. It's functioning, you're not functioning. It's relevant, you're not. And so it does that through a range of different ways. Probably some of the more pernicious, and Foucault talked about this back in the 60s when he had his debate with Chomsky, which was to say some of the most benign institutions in our society are actually the ones that purvey the most dangerous sorts of thoughts to people. So, for example, mental health. Giving people the idea that there's something biologically wrong with them that causes them to be depressed. Give them the idea that there's something genetically out of order that causes them to feel trauma more intensely. Giving them the idea that there are diagnoses that are indications of their ability to thrive emotionally or psychologically. That it is something wrong with them that causes them to feel pain and trauma and psychic dislocation. Because then we can give you drugs that you can buy from us that will mute all of those feelings, but it won't really fix it. They won't last a long time. You'll have to keep changing them. But what you really need to understand is that you are psychically and emotionally dysfunctional. Not that we have set up a society that is inherently traumatizing, that is inherently discouraging, that is inherently indicates to you that you are not valuable. Of course, human beings respond emotionally to this. But the way we translate that, or the way capital translates that psychologically, is you're mentally ill. And then we have huge, benign, lovely mental health campaigns by well-meaning liberal people saying, please get in and get diagnosed. Please get in and get your medication. Please get in and make sure that you understand that you're depressed. Please get in and understand your trauma. Please get in and be seen by a counselor. Please get into your local mental health center and be inducted into this system that is telling you not that we are communally out of our minds, not that we live in a mad society, but that you individually are psychologically, biologically, neurologically failing. And we can help you. We can help you by giving you drugs and fixing you. But we can't really fix you. So that's one mechanism, is to make sure that everyone thinks they're crazy, that we individually think we're crazy. And so we don't talk to each other about, hey, why are we all depressed? What in the world? Why are we all so anxious? Maybe it's the way we're organizing society. Maybe we could organize society differently. Maybe we would feel better if we did that, right? Maybe it's not us individually. Maybe collectively, there's something in the society that is inherently toxic and traumatizing, and that we should pay attention to that, not to the fact that we're individually failing. So that's one mechanism. The other mechanism is education, in which we continually show our students that we don't care about them, that institutions don't care about them, that they don't necessarily, that they continue to charge them more and more money for less and less education, that they continue to offer them degrees that no longer do what they claim that they're going to do. We have huge ad campaigns that say, you've got to go to university, you've got to get a degree, it's the only way forward, when there is no way forward. And so students are then told, well, it's you. You didn't, I know you got good grades, but you didn't get the right references, you didn't get the right letter, you didn't get the right degree, you didn't get the right certificate, you didn't get into the right field. I just noticed in Australia that they, for the very first time, they're charging anyone who wants to go into the humanities the same amount of money as going to law school or medical school, because they don't want people to go into the humanities. They want them to go into the STEM sciences or the professional schools. Where my partner works at the university, they have just restructured all of the departments in such a way as to say that the only way you can be an individual department is become a professional school, so that when you come out, you have a degree that will allow you to do something. So education is incredibly set up in such a way. We also, of course, have at the lower levels, at the grade school and the elementary schools and the high schools and so forth. All of those we don't fund. We don't give anyone the resources to do the job, and then continually tell the students and the teachers the schools are failing. Well, of course they're failing. You're not giving them the resources adequate to do the job. You're not giving them even books. You're not even giving them computers. You're not giving them any of the things necessary to do the job. And then you declare them as failures. So by the time they get to university, they don't have the requisite skill set to be able to do the work. So then we have to scale back the level of education at university to what used to be high school. So that undergraduate degrees are really the first couple of years just recouping what you should have learned in high school. So you see the deal, right? So what that does is it leads people to feel inadequate. Like, well, I don't really understand. And then, of course, we remove things like history and philosophy that would allow people to make sense of the world and to have a sense of how the world is put together. So neoliberalism instead says, look, the reason you go to school is to get a job. It's not to learn. It's not to become a critic. It's not to be able to develop the kinds of skills necessary to produce yourself as a unique, amazing human being. No, the reason you go to school is so you can come out. It doesn't matter what you really learn in there. Just whatever you get at the end, you should be able to hand it to an employer and they should say, oh, okay, we'll give you a job, right? That's neoliberalism, right? So again, you get this sense of failure, of lack, right? And then, of course, in the judicial system, similarly, of course, we have the police here in the United States shooting people, and we have the federal agents going out grabbing people off the street who are trying to protest. The judicial system, people keep saying, well, the judicial system, the police are failing. No, they're not failing. They're doing precisely and exactly what they were designed to do, which is to operate as agents of the state in order to make sure that people don't cause the capitalist class too much trouble, right? So they're fine with folks tearing down statues. That's symbolic. Again, going back to our conversation about race, right? But they're not about to change the actual algebra that continues to put loads of white men with billions of dollars in charge of things. And we'll put a few folks here and there and so forth, but it doesn't actually change the material actuality. So long way around. So in answer to your question, what we need to do is to step outside of those frameworks and start to talk to each other as human beings. That we need to understand that we are engaged with nature in an intimate, entangled set of relations. That we can't ignore our communities and our families and our friends. That we can't ignore the actual material aspects. In other words, we have to acknowledge that, wait a minute, this is no way to organize a society. This is not beneficial to any of us. This isn't working except for a very, very small group of people. And we have to build alternative modes of relation. We have to set up small pockets of alternative economies, alternative ways of thinking, of alternative ways of living, of alternative ways of producing the world, of alternative ways of educating ourselves. And we have to continue, we have to start building alternatives. It's extremely unlikely that the ruling class is going to respond to our entreaties in any meaningful sort of way. It's not to their advantage. All they're going to do is give us enough to try to get us to calm down a little bit, to get us to admit that, okay, if you don't calm down, we're not going to let you in the door. If you don't calm down, we're not going to let you be part of this. But they're not going to let you be part of it anyway. It's not going to happen except for a very few people. And so they'll let a few folks through the door, and maybe some folks that are, gay or black or Latino or from the global south, let a few folks through the door symbolically to say, look, we're moving forward, so calm the hell down. But how do you change it? As an educator, as a youth worker? By building material, alternative sets of material relations, by encouraging people to seek their own desire, not to seek the desires that they're fed. And it doesn't matter if they have all the data on you. That's fine, whatever. It's irrelevant. That's irrelevant. What's important is that you have the data on you, that you are sharing your lived experience with each other, that you are materially engaging in loving and kind ways in your community, that you are, I'm not saying cut yourself off from social media or whatever, that's fine, go ahead and do that. But in addition, don't rely on the educational system to be educated. Don't rely on social media for emotional needs. Don't rely on money as the only pathway forward to success in your life. Build alternatives for each of those things. build an alternative way of producing your life, in which you get your material needs met through your relations and intersections with nature and other people. Reconnect to the land, reconnect to gardening, reconnect to each other in terms of material exchanges of what you can do. Build your life outside. Doesn't mean cut yourself off from. You can't live outside capital. That's not possible. It's an all-pervasive global system. But you have to become what Deleuze and Guattari talk about as vacuoles of non-communication. A vacuole, by the way, is a small postule within a system that is sort of a diseased thing that has a way of mutating a system. And so we need to be postules within capitalism. We need to become little alternative bits within the body of capitalism that provide an alternative, something else. I mean, I would argue that I don't think capitalism is sustainable for an extended period of time. It's already in rather desperate straits. So what comes after? Well, that depends on what we do. You can absolutely guarantee that people who have fascistic authoritarian tendencies are already building alternatives, and they're quite willing to step in and quite happy if capitalism collapses and to use all means and force to build a rather unpleasant and nasty system. But are we doing the same? Or are we succumbing ourselves to despair and lack and irrelevance and being scared? Because if you're scared, and there's plenty of reason to be nervous and anxious and scared, without a doubt, the only antidote to that is with each other, to find courage in our social relations, because it takes a lot of courage to go forward. And we are also sold this crazy idea, oh, you can change the world without any personal cost. No, you can't. It will cost you. And in some cases, they will kill you. No doubt. They'll jail you. If you're at all successful, they're quite likely to try to harm you. So it takes courage. And it takes a willingness to take risks. And it takes a willingness to be creative collectively. And in a very peculiar way, it means letting go of the individual, letting go of ourself. Because it's the biggest form of capture that capitalism utilizes. You know, the individual was originally built in the Renaissance as a revolutionary possibility to get free of the collective church and the collective God, right? And the individual was very successful in being quite radical and revolutionary for quite a long time. It doesn't function anymore. It doesn't work that way. It's a mode of induction. It's a mode of separation and alienation. It's a vehicle in which they can download all failure and all lack and all depression and all into you. And so we have to let it go. It's got to go if we're going to really do this. It has to be we that does this. It can't be me that does this. And that's why the neoliberal sort of prescriptions for self-actualization and empowerment and entrepreneurship and me, you know, this teleological me has to go, because it's a mode of addiction and cannot be sober. And we need to be sober. We need to find sobriety. And I don't mean from drugs and alcohol. Please take all the drugs you like. I mean sober in more important ways. That is to say, to see with clear eyes the material actualities of our situation. So.
And so I will bring in, I don't know if you, so there was a Indian philosopher, an original thinker. His name was Krishnamurti. And in fact, so it's interesting that although he's from the global south, when I was first, and actually I would want to know your feedback on that as well. I first stumbled upon his work in 2010. And after reading first few pages, I was like, forget it. I couldn't deal with him, because what he just said is that, you know, the idea of self, you know, what do you think about yourself is the accumulation. And again, I use this reference very often because first, you know, going to Western academia and having interaction with you, I asked you this question that, you know, Hans, I find you very down to earth, humbling, given, you know, your immense, you know, achievement in academia, yada, yada, yada. And then you said something very important to me, and that's stuck with me, is that respect happens between equals. So in a society, particularly in academia, and me being an educator, and I really, really want to be a successful educator, like a Freudian educator, in the process of conscientization, understanding, all you're saying, to me at the back of my head, it feels like this is Freire talking, is that, basically learn to read the world, learn to read the nature. Like, for instance, when I talk to my parents, I'll give you example of my mother. She raised 11 children. She has never gone to school. She doesn't know how to read and write. She knows how to read the nature. She knows, many cures, many things. But I think it's, if you try to convince her that, she is educated, she can read, it's going to be very hard for you to convince her that she can read and write. So our understanding of reading, our understanding of being educated is very different. So as you have said, is that don't rely on institution to be educated. Don't.
Yeah, no. So a couple of three things. One, education is a collective process. The way that we have organized it makes it seem as though there is an educator and the educated. But at least in my own teaching, I am useless without the students. I can't write without my students. I can't think without my students. I can't think without other philosophers, without other teachers, without other thinkers, without other activists. I can't do anything unless I have a multiplicity of collective inputs on an ongoing basis that are flowing through me. Of course, they're shaped by the unique configuration of my particular body-mind into various ways of speaking and articulating things that are unique to my capacities as a body and a mind. But it's a collective process. I'm immersed in a collective sea of ideas and thoughts and experiences. And those come together in the same way that they come together for an artist or a novelist or a painter in the production of a work, which we talk about as teaching. And so I'm a conduit. That's all. I pass things pass through me, and because of the way that my life has configured me, it comes through in unique kinds of ways. But I think we need to start to think collectively about this. We need to understand that what we do educationally is not a hierarchical set of relations. And I struggle with my students all the time because they're like, oh, you're the professor and I have to do it this way, and blah, 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 blah. And without a doubt, there are times in which I get inducted into those hierarchies as well, and enjoy the feeling of importance and power that comes with, being a professor, blah, 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 blah. But that's really trivial. It's really, really trivial. Because what's really true is that all of us are thinking together. All of us are writing together. All of us are being activists together. All of us have so many interesting perspectives. All of my students have really important things to tell me. And I hope I have a few things to tell them. And when they're brought together, then we have some things to say collectively as a group that is an amalgam, an entanglement of all of those things. And there are loads and loads and loads of great teachers that understand things outside of written words and academic language that also need to be incorporated and thought. Some of the most important things that have helped me to understand the world have nothing to do with anything I learned in academia. They've been built in personal relationships and with teachers who, some of whom don't read and write. And so all of that, life is the collective canvas here. Life is what produces and creates. Yes, it gets structured socially into certain sorts of structures, but to the degree we accede to those structures and take them too seriously, then we will lose. If we hierarchize and taxonomize knowledge in ways that says that this is important knowledge and this is not important knowledge, there's knowledge that is more or less adequate to certain purposes at any given point in time. And everyone has something to contribute. everything has something to say, and everyone has something that can lead us to act. And it doesn't matter where it comes from. It matters, its effect is what matters. And so what matters is the effect of a set of interactions, whether it's in a university classroom or walking in the woods, or sitting down with an elder. These things are all important, not in and of themselves, but in terms of the effect that they have. And so if we're going to look at what's valuable to me, following Spinoza, what's important is whether or not they allow us to do more things. And so whoever we talk to, whoever our collective is, whoever our whatever milieu we're immersed in of nature and human beings and thoughts and ideas, and experiences, whatever that stew is that we're saturated through with, what's important is, does it allow us to do more, to create more, to love more, to feel more? Does it allow for these things? And that can't happen on our own. To be alone and alienated and isolated is to feel less, to love less, to do less.
Yeah, and not to mention, as we just have mentioned about Spinoza, I'm sorry, can you hear me? It's raining here, so it's my team.
I hear it, yeah.
Okay. So, speaking of Spinoza, that Spinoza was criticized heavily by his community. Auguste Boal was imprisoned, for talking about, his work, right? When he used, pedagogy of the theory of the oppressed, right? So that was not easy work. So in terms of one of the things that I was wondering, and I really want to know your perspective. So before you come into academia, you have worked on the street for a long time. So I remember you and I had one conversation that your academic journey you came late. First, it was like on the street, that, and a lot of organizing, youth work, and etc. So as the global capital can move quickly with the computer being part of it now, is it possible to understand the nature of capitalism without global solidarity, exchange of knowledge, understanding that basically how things are happening in the United States and how things are happening in Bangladesh? Like when somebody's buying a, very cheap T-shirt in, let's say a store in Georgia, probably will not know that at what cost it is coming, right? When somebody sitting in Toronto is, being proud about Canada's multiculturalism, doesn't probably know that Canada's, natural resource exploiting company has caused damage, in Bangladesh, that, in areas where children are today being born with physical complexity because the gas is still, leaking. And well, we couldn't do anything because, the kind of, impunity, I would say, white impunity they have, the North impunity they have, like, okay, I can do whatever the hell I want to do. So in that case, what are some of the meaningful ways of building global solidarity to understand the interconnectedness of global capitalism and to stop exploitation? Because if somebody in Georgia doesn't get aware that, hey, this shirt is coming from Bangladesh, I don't think it's going to be very effective. So what's your thought on that, from organizing and also in academia?
All right, so I would say that I'm opposed to two things in that regard. One is any sense of purity in politics, that one can step outside of capital and act in pure ways. I don't think that's possible. I think you're going to buy things that are compromised. I think you're going to participate in activities that are compromised. I think that there is no purity in living within global capital. It's an all-pervasive, all-invasive system. So I don't think the way towards revolution or revolt or rebellion effectively has anything to do with purity. I think that's when you say, I'm not going to buy T-shirts from here, I'm not going to buy food from there, I'm not going to do this act or that act, that's fine, but let's not mistake it for the revolution. It might make things a little better somewhere, It might, in fact, cause capital to shift. But that's what it's going to do, is cause capital to shift. Capital is too flexible and fluid that way. You don't buy a T-shirt there, that's fine, we'll make it over here. They don't care about that. What it does is that it reinforces the self in terms of, I'm a good. I'm really nervous about well-meaning people in the global north, and particularly white folks throughout the world, but also upper middle class or middle class people across the world, wanting to get a pass, wanting to say, I'm one of the good ones. I'm not participatory in this. I don't buy T-shirts from here. I grow my own vegetables. I don't use racist words. I'm kind to people. And so I get a pass. I'm not really complicit as those bad people over there that are causing all of the trouble. I don't support that. There is no pass. We're all in it. Every one of us is complicit. And there is no out that way. The second thing that I would be opposed to is any sense of morality. We seem to be introducing religion through the back door in terms of wanting to say that we are morally superior to certain other human beings because they're racist, sexist, homophobic, that they say the wrong things, that they're capitalists, that they're, and so we're better. We're better people. We're more moral people. We're more righteous people. We don't invoke God as much. I think the church, liberal left church, is coming back a little bit in other places around the world and in the United States, but it's not terribly powerful. But we do have a secular discourse that seems to rely on righteousness. And I'm very, very nervous about that. Righteousness is a form of hierarchy and taxonomy that exempts us again. I'm on the good side. I'm the righteous people. And that pretty inevitably leads to some form of fascism, because you're better than. And so when the revolution comes, we'll jail and kill and maim all of these bad people, or re-educate them, God forbid. So I don't think either one of those two things is the way to do things and build solidarity across, at least meaningful solidarity that would challenge capitalism, because capital loves that kind of stuff. You want to have a revolution, we'll sell you the signs. We'll sell you the guns. We'll sell you anything that you need because we don't really care if a nation state falls. It's irrelevant to us. One nation goes down, that's fine. We'll move somewhere else, or we'll negotiate economic terms with the new nation. You want to be, you can have a revolution and overthrow the government. We've seen this time and time again. They're going to overthrow the government. They're going to institute this wonderful new liberal democracy, but they're not going to change any of the economic relations. Corporations are still going to be there. The most nefarious kinds of nasty bits of capitalist corporations are going to rebuild the country at tremendous profit from the war. They're going to help you set up your liberal democratic education system. All the same shit's just going to be redone in a new vessel. Because you haven't challenged capitalism's logic per se. So I think that's also true at the university. The neoliberal incursions into the university, in which universities are now treated as corporations, and we have presidents who are really CEOs, and we consolidate departments, and we come up with new buzzwords, and we try to and we suck all the public money out and only bring private money in, so that business interests can tell us what kinds of departments we should have, what sort of degrees we can take, et cetera, and so forth. And working conditions, professors get treated as though they're simply on an assembly line and don't have any particular expertise or knowledge. All of these kinds of things in the neoliberal university. And so then we have movements among faculty to take it back and to build, but what they want to rebuild is the old-fashioned institution that they had before. And that was problematic in a whole range of other ways. But there's very little thought being given to, if we were to take this institution forward outside of capitalist logic, what would that look like? And I think it would be very different than the old institution of the model of the European Ivy League colonial institution that we're also in love with. So I think in terms of building solidarity internationally, it goes back to Marx 101, which is that you build sets of relations built on material actualities in any given location. And then you figure out how those material actualities interact with other material actualities. I think that the folks in Chiapas in southern Mexico, Commander Zero and those guys, I mean, they've done some really remarkable things in that sort of way, dealing with actual material actualities. How do you rebuild your community? How do you rebuild your local conditions? And how do you then communicate? And we have the virtual capacity to talk with each other like you and I are talking right now, in terms of brainstorming and thinking about a future that is outside of capitalist logic, that is built on our actual material sets of relations, not on this aspirational model of I want to be a millionaire. But how do we actually talk with one another about how do we solve local problems effectively, and how do people work together to improve their own material conditions and make capitalism irrelevant rather than capitalism trying to make us irrelevant. We're not irrelevant. If we're irrelevant to capitalism, that's fine. I don't want to belong necessarily to capitalism. But if we are relevant to each other and support one another and build networks, material networks of care with each other, then we become relevant to life, not to abstraction.
So, one of the things that I definitely know, something that I have taken from here is that the concept of purity. There's no that's one of the points that extremely opposing, and understandably that capitalism and it's all invasive, all pervasive, and it's question is, and you have mentioned about Gilles Deleuze, the idea of that vacuole, the idea of, and I'm translating roughly, it's the liminality, the space between the space, that has not yet been co-opted by the capitalist logic, and how do you exist there? Now, outside the capitalist logic 101, again, in one of our past conversations, you were mentioning that in different societies, people started trying something, which is not very conventional. And they're like, oh, I can actually do it. And then, they, and you would, at times, you would mention the work of Hart and Negri, when, in their ways of. So if we were to bring about a global solidarity outside the capitalist logic, and you mentioned one like, this sort of, relationality, what are some of the tools, thinking tools, that we could use to actually think outside the capitalist logic to make us more skilled to go to that space of liminality and exist more efficiently there?
Well, I think we have to. We're in the process of writing a book on what we're calling desettlering, which is undoing the settler unconscious for those of us who were settlers during the colonial period and who've inherited the settler legacy from the colonial. And in thinking that, I was reading something recently, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the reference off the top of my head, but someone was talking about we need to unontologize ourselves, which is to say we have to completely undo our traditional and habitual way of being, which means that we need to identify those aspects of logic that first built coloniality and then built capitalism, because it's a logic. And there are a couple of, there are just a few that I can think of off the top of my head. One of them is binary logics, this or that. We have to start thinking in multiplicities and entanglements. Karen Barad's work is fantastic on this. Post-humanist feminists are really good on this. We have to undo notions of hierarchy and taxonomy. We have to undo any sense of privilege. We have to undo the self, the individual. So there's a lot of undoing that has to get done prior to doing, or in the process of doing. Foucault also in his debate with Chomsky says that if you're attempting to build a new society, but you neglect to critique adequately all of the elements of the old society, you will inadvertently bring those old elements with you into the new society, and they will corrupt it and begin to undo it. And I think that's the danger, is that to the degree we remain capitalists at whatever level, or colonialists at whatever level, to the degree we bring those logics into our solutions, then we'll just continue to build variations on the old system. And that's fine. Maybe some of those variations would be kinder and gentler and less vicious and less brutal. but they would still contain within them the ability to enslave and harness us to things outside of our own capacities for production and creation. And that would be a shame. So we have to do a lot of undoing. It's sort of like being an addict, because we are, of course, addicted to this system. And being an addict, the way that people break out of addiction is generally they bottom out. That is to say, the addiction doesn't function for them anymore. And I think part of the problem for us in terms of building global solidarity or movements that function is that for many of us, we're not ready to let go of the substance. We're not ready to let go of our attachment to wealth and to material things and to prestige and to us, them thinking. We want to keep all of that, but change the world. And I don't know how you do that. I'm not sure how you do that. You can reform bits and pieces of it, of course. You can make the justice system a little less brutal. You can perhaps get some folks hired who are currently not being hired, but you're still being hired. You're still being enslaved to 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week, hundreds and hundreds of hours a year, to working for someone you probably don't particularly like, doing stuff you don't particularly want to do in order to buy shit you don't really want. And that means that, yes, it can be less mean, less traumatizing, but it won't be really any different. And I think that's the real work, is undoing ourselves. Because as we undo ourselves, other things become possible to be undone. And that's challenging because you have to hit bottom. It has to not work for you anymore. You have to get to a place of saying, that just doesn't work for me. I'm just not going to do that because it doesn't work. And then you have to go through withdrawal, which is nasty. And then you have to, there's something really, really tricky in addiction, which is that even if you have gotten sober, cut yourself off from the substance, the logic of being an addict sticks with you. And so you can be completely drug or alcohol free and still act like an addict. You can still lie, you can still steal, you can still be in denial. And you can be completely drug or alcohol free, but be what's called a dry drunk, which is to say you're behaving just like an alcoholic, you just don't drink it. And you're just as mean and just as violent and just as dishonest, you're just not drinking. And I think for those of us who are thinking seriously about challenging the current system, we have to be very, very careful that we don't repudiate capitalism, that we grow our own food, and don't buy T-shirts from Bangladesh, and certainly not racist or sexist or homophobic. We have all of these lovely attributes, and yet we're still righteous in our hierarchies and taxonomies. We're still dismissive of other people. We're still valorizing ourselves. We're still all about being healthy and being emotionally well. It's got all of these vestiges of neoliberalism filtered through our system, so that we're, essentially want to be better people. And that the pathway to being, a better person is to challenge the existing system, so that we're the righteous ones. And I think that's a version of being a dry drunk. You may be free of the addiction to capitalism, but you're still behaving within all the logics of the old system.
Mm-hmm. I have a question here from a very good friend. Is that, what do you think of the concept of capitalism at the heart? Example, the employees do have a social conscience and do treat their employees well.
I think it's exactly what you said it is, which is a kinder, gentler capitalism. But they're still their employees. It's sort of like being, a slave to a kind slave owner. You're still a slave. So, we can. I'm not opposed, by the way, to kinder, gentler capitalism. That's better. But It's sort of like children's rights, which is sort of a problematic concept in many, many respects. But if it gets someone clean water someplace or gets them the ability to go to school on a day, I'm all in favor of it. But let's not mistake band-aids for revolutions. It can be better. That's good, no doubt. And I think to the degree we treat each other more kindly, that's fantastic. But to the degree the capitalist is still making a profit off other people's labor and stealing their labor from them, it's still theft, and it's still unconscionable to some degree. And it still creates for the person who is the employee the inability to really recoup the fruit of their labor, and it still restricts their daytime activities in ways that doesn't allow them to be able to do all that they could do with their day. And it still probably restricts their activities in ways that means they can't raise their children fully the way they might want to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kinder, it's nicer, without a doubt, but it's still a relationship of enslavement.
Yeah. So one of the works that I wanted to get into is that in the work of Krishnamurti, he talked about this idea. It's called freedom from knowledge. What he would argue, he argued in his work, is that when I'm looking at the world through a set of concepts, the concepts are shaping my perception. That is a perception which is not free and independent perception. So his idea, what he's talking about, is the ability to. So you talked about deontology or undoing the self, which is daunting and scary, because if I have somehow gathered a set of ideas about me, this is who Feroz is, this is A, B, C, D, and all of that, to let that go is actually setting into a kind of unknown, the unknown. Now, I have one and another follow-up question. I'll just, so that I don't forget myself. So some evolutionary biologists, they would say that how human beings have evolved, our inability to deal with the uncertainty. That's why we have, developed all different kinds of stories. When we look at us in comparison to you have mentioned it very, clearly, that the ecology is indifferent to us. It's not that it doesn't like you, it doesn't hate you. It just, it is what it is, right? So when we look at this vast, indifferent universe, and we understand that the universe doesn't care, and that creates this an existential anxiety in us, and then we come up with different kinds of stories and all different kinds that actually calms us a little bit. And that story can be calming, and that story can be very righteous. If you look at the history of humanity, a lot of the stories have been brutally violent, literally stories, and that has caused genocide and all of that. So in that case, in 2020, in the midst of a global pandemic, what has it taught us about our addiction to story, our addiction to fiction, our addiction to knowledge, which goes against in a lot of the theorizing and in academia, etc., and to what extent it has been successful to create relatively more kinder, gentler society? Is it possible to look at the world without buying into some kind of concepts, or how do we undo ourselves in that case?
So a couple of thoughts. One, I would suggest that what you proposed is an entirely binary formation, as though we're sitting outside of this in different universes, though we're not part of it, and that the universe sits outside of us, and as a result of which it's scary to us because it doesn't care about us. We're part of it. To the degree one understands that at a phenomenological level, experience that one experiences oneself as part of their immediate lived environment and all of its effects, and actually allows oneself to feel and experience the world in a tangible and physical sort of way. No particular anxiety. It's not as that we have this. That's a really interesting story. That, things have to care about us in terms of valorizing us. It's not the same as valorization. Care has to do with a set of relations that are mutually beneficial for creative expansion and capacity for us to do things. When we say indifferent to us, what we usually mean is that it doesn't valorize us. It doesn't make us important. And I think that's a really nasty sort of binary conception, that we have to be important. We don't have to be important. That's not the name of the game. For me, anyway, it's not the name of the game to be important. What's the name of the game is to be part of, to be creative, to do, to act, to be art, not the artist. And I think that's humbling. Does it mean doing without concepts? No, concepts are like paintbrushes. I mean, they don't, yes, they shape the world, but they only shape the world to the degree we paint certain things, and we can paint different things, and we paint, concepts are tools. They don't reify the world unless we let them. Concepts can do loads of different things, just like a paintbrush can do loads of different things. So you can do lots of things with concepts, other than, I mean, if you get rid of this residual anxiety by understanding that there's nothing wrong, this is just how it is. Antonio Negri was in prison as he was accused of terrorism in North Italy. He wrote a letter back to his comrades who were all despairing about the failure of the revolution and being mad about it, resentful about it, and who snitched on who and why did it fail and blah, 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 blah. And what he said was, we have to be responsible for the world and the failure of the revolution as the world created it. We have to be accountable to that. We did that as much as the state did that. We failed, and they failed. It all failed, and we need to be accountable to that. But the lesson they took from that was not, oh gosh, isn't that awful, isn't that terrible? What he said was, well, the world as it is now is the world that we built. We built. So let's build a different one. Let's not wallow in the fact that it failed, or let's not wallow in the fact that we get nervous, and let's not, and don't ignore it either. It's not a question of saying, well, don't be nervous, forget your anxiety, it's the neoliberal, be a better person. But understand it as a motivation for doing something. The world is you're intricately involved in the ecology. Ecology is not outside us, we are the ecology. Much of what's going on in the ecology is, part of what we have done. We built this ecology along with the ecology itself. It's not indifferent to us. Indifference is different than care in that sense. Ecology is not indifferent. Of course, it's hugely responsive to us, and we're hugely responsive to it. So that's a much more useful way, I think, to talk about that set of relations. And then concepts are allow us to figure out what we can do. Spinoza says that there are ideas that are adequate to understanding the world, and those allow us to do the maximum number of things. And then there are ideas that are inadequate. There's none that are right or wrong or good or bad or they're not. They're just ideas that work better than other ideas. And so the question is not, is an idea right? Is it wrong? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? The question is an idea something that allows you to do more stuff? Does it constrain? And of course, Spinoza says the only way you can really do things or know what you're capable of is interaction with other bodies. And that includes not just human bodies, but all bodies. And so every interaction with everything you interact with gives you some sense of what you're capable of doing. And to the degree you're attentive to the fact that there's loads of different things that you could be doing with all of the things in your environment and all of the human beings and all of the plants and all of the animals and all of the molecules and all of the viruses for that matter, to the degree that you have an adequate understanding of your sets of relations to those things in a way that allows you to be able to be maximally creative and to build new worlds and new peoples, then you have a different formulation of concepts. When Krishnamurti talks about thinking beyond concepts, that is in order to get to there, one would have to do what Spinoza says, which is to have the third kind of knowledge, which is an intuitive sense of how you are, of your positioning vis-a-vis all things flowing around you and through you. And that is what some philosophers refer to as enlightenment. But that would be to have an intuitive sense of your actual relations to everything in your world. That doesn't.
Could you elaborate that a little bit more? Like, that's Spinoza's way of looking at it.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, it's the capacity to be able to intuitively arrange your life in such a way in every single microsecond, so as to be maximally responsive to your environment and your environment to you, and to understand that you are your environment. Then you don't need concepts because you have already intuitively understood things in terms of maximal response to those things that are toxic and those things that are beneficial to you. You don't have to think about it. You already know you're there. And you understand your placement and your relation to all things. Now that's not something that one arrives at accidentally. Well, you can arrive at accidentally, but you can't intentionally get there quickly.
How so?
Well, it takes the capacity to, well, okay, put it this way. To be a really, really fantastic musician, you can't think about the next note. You have to know it when you play it, particularly if you're playing improvisation with a group of musicians that are also improvising, say jazz, or even blues. You have to know the next note. You can't think about it. Say, oh, what should I play here? You have to know it. However, to know it, you have had to go through a lifetime of thinking about the next note. In other words, you have to first learn the scales and know that one note comes after another. You have to know the particular tonalities, the possibilities, the vibrational qualities. In order to do that, you would have had to go through a lifetime of investigating all of those things consciously, right? So you have to consciously investigate all of those things as a musician over a long period of time with multiple interactions and hours and hours and hours of exposure and many gigs and many rehearsals and many private moments to arrive at the time when to some degree you don't need to think about the note, right?
Is that what is that what you refer to what Charlie Mingus talks about? Is that, the truth is so hard because would you connect to that, please?
Yeah, I mean, so Charlie Mingus says the truth is really, really hard to play because, it's you. And that's a lifetime. It's a life art, what I call a life art. And the trouble with most of us is that we're tremendously impatient. And so, for example, when we want social change and so forth, we just want to do it without really investing the time and energy to think it through, to do what Foucault talks about as critiquing every aspect of society in detail and carefully. We don't want to craft revolutions. We just want to have them. We just want to. It's sort of like if you've ever been to a musical event or seen someone on the street who really hasn't practiced very much and just wants to play emotionally with their guitar and sing. That's nice. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. It's quite good in its own respect, but it's not going to be the same experience as listening to someone like Charlie Mingus, who's playing the truth of himself. But the truth of yourself is always changing. It's always shifting. It's always moving, just as your intuitive sense of your environment is always shifting and always changing and always moving. And so at that level, any sort of real revolution is an artistic endeavor that requires a certain amount of discipline and crafting and thinking and making sure that you're not just repeating the same old, just in new models. Which is not to say that when people are really angry and really frustrated and really traumatized that they should express that in street demonstrations or changing legislation. All those things are good. There's nothing wrong with any of those things. They're just not going to get you where you hope to go at the end of the day. Things will get better for a while. Things that are done that way tend to undo themselves. They tend to wax and wane because they're still within the logic of the dominant system. And so, our anxiety, and we live in an age where everyone is quite anxious, which makes tremendous sense if you will buy into the logic that you are a failure and that you need to fix that. If that's how you're living your life, that there's something fundamentally you need to fix about yourself always, every day, and you improve yourself, get better, then yeah, you're going to be anxious because you're never going to get there. And you always make feeling a sense of, oh, I'm not quite what I should be, not doing things quite the way I should.
Mhm. Now, let's. I mean, to me, it's very contentious. Is when we go into the formal education or the way we know, our ways of knowing, or the neoliberal invasion of the academia, when systematically, societally, structurally, sort of like lifetime of induction of anxiety, like ways of knowing that serves the purpose of, and then, and this is what I really want to connect to, that you have mentioned, and as I can see in Bangladesh or in Canada, in pretty much in the name of STEM, as if STEM is out, humanity is outside STEM. I mean, I have to get my immigration done in Canada. Oh my God, it was one hell of a process. I had to work for about almost 3 years. So I've worked in technology companies, software companies. That's where I came to know the daunting and literally sometimes, debilitating capacity of knowing that basically the technology, what it can do. But what is fascinating, Hans, what is really fascinating, a lot of times I try to engage in conversation with these incredibly brilliant engineers who are literally making things that are breaking society, that are like, if you think about Mark Zuckerberg, he's saying, okay, make things fast, break things. That's the motto, right? That's Silicon Valley. If you talk to them, the level of their apolitical consciousness, it's just like literally they're playing games. It's just like writing code, and what is the socioeconomic impact of that code, right? So to me, if you can run a STEM department, a STEM education that has no touch of humanities, philosophy, sociology, and all of that, it actually serves the neoliberal purpose. So in ways of that, is there spaces in academia that is still lives in like that fringe, or that a vacuole where academia is resisting to exist and serve a little bit of purpose of towards greater solidarity and movement against injustice?
Yes, of course. That's why you still have enemies lists of professors. Who discourse that professors are warping children's minds, and of course there are lots and lots and lots of people all over academia doing really, really wonderful work and interesting work. I think what may be being missed there is that I think the design here is to absolutely abolish anything other than Ivy League institutions at the end of the day. And they don't need it anymore. They had them largely state schools and colonial residue schools all over the world were essentially built to develop a managerial class for industrial capitalism. They don't have a lot of purpose anymore. What they really want is trade schools or professional schools, and that's not a university, that's something else. And so I think that the ultimate goal is to abolish the mid-range universities, the universities for working class and middle class kids. And I think that's the gradual movement. They need them to house kids right now because they don't have jobs for them. And so they can sort of warehouse them for a few years there before they realize that, and indoctrinate them into neoliberalism. So when they get out, they think it's their fault they don't have a job. But I think the intention is because they actually still do have people doing the work, it would be much more beneficial to the system to just get rid of them and replace them with, as you're talking about, just straightforward professional schools and trade schools, and get rid of all of these thinking, critiquing, connecting to politics sort of movements, and just have you go learn a trade or learn how to counsel people, or and remove all of that critique stuff, and just make it be about getting a certificate, a license, or a job. And you need certain. That's why they moved to this. Every course has to have objectives, and every course has to have, really, if you meet these objectives, and they have to be framed in a certain sort of language, which is a neoliberal language. And so, in that sense, you can teach around those things, but the student gets the impression that their job is to meet these competencies, not to learn anything. just to reach these competencies so that they can get a license or a job or whatever it is. And as a result of which, you're gutting the heart of the institution, which is to think. And that's what needs for capital. That's the goal. Is to they don't want a working class that thinks. They don't want poor people to think. They don't want formerly middle class people who think. They don't want people with capacity for analysis or historical understanding. They want people that they can tell what it is that they want to tell them through social media as much as they can. That, hey, you know what? The thing is that this is an ahistorical period. We've moved beyond all of that stuff. The real problem in the world is you. And if you get yourself fixed up, life will be good. The system itself doesn't really need to change. It's you that needs to change. And so I think we're going to see in the next 20 years, well, maybe 30 years, those institutions will be radically altered, unrecognizable. Many of them will disappear. We're going to see that with the pandemic already, that a lot of universities are simply going to vanish. They'll be underfunded. We've removed so much state funding from them already, and I think that's going to happen all over the world, that we will no longer see these mid-range universities that they've gone. Well, left, of course, the Ivy League schools, because the rich kids get to things.
Right? You have mentioned Foucault and Chomsky, a few times in a conversation. But if you look at, and this is just my observation, and this is like, I don't have, I haven't read any papers about it, etc. So if you look at the pattern of academics these days, the tenured professors, the universities are getting run more and more by adjunct faculties in a contract professors. I have looked into reports that where they're severely financially struggling to continue their teaching.
Right.
Now if this is how things are happening, in that case, and they are systematically choked. Do you see that academic giants with very strong intellectual integrity, like Foucault or Chomsky, are coming in future?
Well, I think we already know they're under attack. That's already the case. I know of several full professors who have been let go for bucking the system, insubordination, and I think we'll probably see more of that. But I also think that they're simply thinning the ranks at the bottom end, which is hiring fewer and fewer professors, right, and more adjunct. And I mean, this is not accidental. People sort of treat it like, oh, isn't it a shame the university's tax base isn't what it used to be, and isn't it a shame that we have to have these new administrative structures, and we need all these vice presidents and vice presidents to vice presidents, and we need all of these deans and associate deans and associate deans. We need, right, but we don't really need professors any longer, because we can always, build a virtual course. I mean, when I was at Brock, the big drive from the administration was having the professors build, online courses, and then relinquish the ownership to the university, so the university could farm them out to, bachelor's level administrators who would simply just put them online and then grade papers, or even have the papers graded virtually, because you can do that, of course, now. So what do you need professors for? I mean, right? So we do want some research, of course, but we only want the right kind of research. I know at my own university, I write quite a lot of books and articles and so forth and so on. But when I read the publicity about the research and the research excellence that our institution is doing, I'm not there. Whatever I do is not in those descriptions by any stretch of the imagination. So only certain kinds of research will get to be rewarded and acknowledged, or even publicized. And so, it's the days of the university as we knew it, with tenured professors and full professors and all of that, it'll still exist, but in a much, much scaled back version, probably only in the Ivy League schools, the state schools, for middle class and working class kids. I think that's going to be unrecognizable. Be very few professors working there. And of course, it's the neoliberalism. If you want to know what's going to happen to the university, look what happened to the auto industry. They're doing the same.
Sure.
If you want to look at what's going to happen to the university, look at the auto industry. It's the same strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
they're
wow.
help them, just like they got the employees at Ford to help them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so what do you think? Like, for instance, and I will quote Chomsky again. That Chomsky, his idea, and I want to connect it to our academic, setup, in around the world. According to Chomsky, COVID-19 is a colossal neoliberal market failure. It's not that the scientists didn't know, after the swine flu, that okay, there is such a strain of virus which is developing and we should be careful. But the market doesn't have any interest or incentive to, protecting the virus to be coming. So okay, all right. And if we think about connect to Bangladesh, to this, is that we are. It's there is an element of explanation. It's hard to explain if you don't see it. So the kind of climate catastrophe, the kind of, like I just did a webinar 2 days ago with policymakers and chairmen of our villages about rapid water clogging. And what I found fascinating there, and I was actually being a bit of annoying educator there, is they're saying, we will have more and more floods like this. We will have more and more water problem, like arsenic contamination, river overflowing, but if you go to the rural level of the students who are in high school, who are heading towards starvation, who are heading towards many different kinds of problem, for them, they are not actually taught that basically what's the reason behind it. Dare I say is that as in Bangladesh we study some version of Columbus was a hero, and still in mass level that consciousness has not created. And one of the things we do, we try to promote critical literacy. So in Bangladesh, the climate education is very neoliberal. It's about management of the nature, very managerial in a version of, yeah. In the face of this problem, what we try to do, we try to push back, with different set of literacy, different set of education. What has COVID-19 exposed about academia and knowledge production? And do you see, chambers of hope that has come out of COVID-19, not before, like out of COVID-19?
So I hear three questions. So in the first place, yes, I think that capital as a system is indifferent to human suffering unless absolutely pushed, which is harder and harder to do because capital, international, global capital, has less and less interest in nation states. They don't really care about them. And so nation states are sort of squabbling over the leftovers from global capital in terms of corruption and payoffs and how much money they can accrue to themselves as the leaders of nation states. So in that sense, capital is indifferent, and as a result of that, the nation state is largely indifferent, except to the degree that they don't want things to get so bad in the nation state that there's possibility of real serious challenges to capital. Which is why in the United States we essentially have two Republicans running for president. One of them claims to be a Democrat.
Okay.
We have a very right-wing Republican. We have basically a centrist Republican running for office.
Sorry, can you speak to that, please? If somebody needs a bit of background. Yeah.
I mean, obviously Trump is psychotic and right-wing. Well, if he's even right-wing, he's a fascist, or at least a wannabe fascist. Biden, on the other hand, is simply very, very middle. I mean, if he was in Canada, he'd be a mid-range conservative Republican. He's very pro-business and very, very pro-capital, and doesn't want to upset the apple cart by having too much health care. And he's a centrist Republican. We don't actually have a Democratic candidate running. We had some chances to do that, but we didn't choose to do that as a nation because we're too nervous.
And what do you think about Bernie's withdrawal? And it's a very political question, and it was very important for us to know.
Well, I mean, I think that he simply didn't get the support that he had hoped for. The United States people in the United States were too nervous, and so they went for for comfort food. And you have to remember, most people in the nation states are still inducted into the belief that this is the best system. It's just maybe got some problems. And I think so this actually gets me to the second question, which is, I think we're living at the edge of a dying empire. Some of us in the middle of a dying empire, which is the system is collapsing. It's not functioning the way it's supposed to, or the way it claims to want to function. And it's kind of a runaway escalatory system, as Bateson would have it, which is to say it continues to attempt to generate profit no matter what the cost, and it's escalating faster and faster and faster. And at the same time, the edges are coming looser and looser and looser, and some of the middle parts as well. So the whole thing is sort of gradually flying apart, and that has certain kinds of repercussions, of course. One of which is a certain kind of indifference to the effects, because they don't actually hit dead in the center. The effects hit harder at the edges. So it's okay if a few islands go underwater and people lose where they lived for centuries. It's okay if some people in Siberia are experiencing 100-degree temperatures and wildfires. It's okay if there are floods in Bangladesh. Those don't really impact the center of the system. So, I mean, it's okay if, certain kids are exposed to toxic chemicals in the water supply in Flint, Michigan. And these things are seen as things that need to be reformed. They're not read as what I think they are, which is signs of a system that's beginning to come apart, that can no longer function or deal effectively with its effects, what it does. So in that sense, the pandemic, to me, is logical, bound to happen, inevitable, given the way that we've treated ourselves and the planet. We're going to set a lot more of these viruses in a bit. I don't mean necessarily out of labs or something like that, but just that the way we've structured our relations to ecology is such that it's logical that they would spread the way that they have spread. We don't have really effective ways of organizing ourselves because we don't really understand. Viruses are really, really interesting, and their mutations and variability. Our kind of system we don't know how to deal with material variability because we're so focused on virtual material, virtual shifting of things, difference. So, do I see any hope in academia given the pandemic? Sure. I don't know that we have a whole. I mean, the academia and the medical community and all of those folks have responded pretty nicely to saying, "Look, this is what we should do, and this is how we can manage it." And we had folks in place to do that all over the world, and everyone ignored them, and they're continuing to ignore them, in spite of the fact it's life-threatening and they can kill you. Which raises the question, along with the opioid addiction, as to how, and also shooting each other and mass shootings of each other and stabbings of each other, all of it. We have R.D. Laing predicted long ago in the 60s that we were a society bent on psychotic suicide. And that certainly seems to be the trend, that we were killing ourselves. Now, it's interesting, Franco Basaglia, who was the founder of deinstitutionalization for mental institutions in Italy back in the 60s and 70s, he had a really interesting idea about if an inmate in a psychiatric institution stayed there long enough, they would become imbricated into the rhythms and practices of that institution in such a way that they would be unable to separate themselves from the institution. They would become so heavily identified with the institution that they would be unable to see themselves as separate from it. He said under such circumstances, the only way that one can rebel then against the institution is by harming oneself. In other words, you have to destroy yourself because it's the only way of separating yourself from the institution. It is conceivable that we are also deeply imbricated into capitalism, that our only way of separating ourselves from the system or rebelling against it is suicidal, is to harm or kill ourselves or each other. And killing each other is the same as killing ourselves, of course. And similarly, our inability to respond rationally to a virus, even though academia is informing us as to what we might do, might well be seen as a form of social suicide. Another way to think about this is there are certain communities in the world right now that really function as prisons, in the sense that you can't get out of them. Once you're in them, you can't leave. The only difference between them and a prison is that you don't have an end of a sentence. There's no end to your sentence. You will be there for life. They're life sentences. And so certain refugee camps, certain really poor communities, certain impoverished communities in the United States, certain groups where a lot of Trump supporters live in dire poverty, those are prison settings. You can't leave them. There's no way out of them. And there's no end in sight. It's a life sentence. And one of the things we know about people who are sentenced to prison in particularly brutal conditions is they start killing each other, and they start self-harming, and they get addicted to drugs and so forth and so on. So I think a lot of what we're seeing is open-air prisons across the world that we're not identifying as such. They're just communities to us. They're ghettos, they're barrios, they're white trash, trailer courts, whatever they are. White trash is such an unfortunate term, but they're my folks, so I guess I can use it. Those communities are essentially open-air prisons, and like many prisons, they're spaces of brutality and violence. And it's not surprising to me that people are ignoring those particular people in larger numbers than other groups who have more mobility, are ignoring things that would keep them safe.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And of course, the population in the United States that's ignoring the advice is young people in the 20s. And again, we've talked about how those folks are in a position where so much of what they've been promised seems to be infinitely deferred. So why the hell not? Whatever.
Yeah. We have a question, from one of my direct professor and a very renowned anthropologist of Bangladesh. So his question, Professor Zahir Ahmed, his question is: in neoliberalism, individuals are to take responsibility for their own health, while the state is no longer expected to do so. How would you explain COVID-19 in the era of pandemic, Professor Zahir Ahmed?
Well, I think that's well said. I mean, that's part of the downloading, right? Is that the system becomes opaque. In other words, the government response becomes invisible in light of you need to do it yourself. And so instead of seeing it as a systemic problem in which we've not organized society in ways that allows us to care for ourselves. I mean, in the United States, for example, one of the discourses that is not as predominant, it is on the edges in some places, is the fact that we don't have adequate health care here. And so our health care is dependent on people having jobs if those employers provide it, not the state. And the state has a very limited province within healthcare, and the Trump administration has even limited that further. So here we have a pandemic and loads of people getting sick and needing to be hospitalized or receiving care, and we don't have a healthcare system for it. And we have people being unemployed because businesses are being shut down as a response, and so they're losing their health insurance. And so you have millions and millions of people who are getting sick and have no health care. Or if they're going to go to the hospital, they can count on being indebted, to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. That conversation is not being had because the responsibility of the state to provide health care for its citizens is a contentious conversation in the United States and not an assumption. And so you're absolutely right. The state has no responsibility. It's your responsibility. What the hell were you thinking if you didn't cover yourself for your health care needs? Or, here's the other one, that you didn't vote for health care, so it's your own damn fault. What are you thinking?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
The wrong candidate who didn't get your healthcare system in place, you didn't get burning in there or whatever. So it's still your fault that you're sick and don't have health insurance. So yeah, no, I think the neoliberal discourse of downloading everything to the individual absolutely takes the state off the hook. Although that discourse, at least in the United States where I am, is beginning to shift, and people are becoming increasingly dissatisfied with the state's response and their inability to care for. And this is one of the reasons to say the system is fraying. Capitalism has always been really good at to spot when people are reaching their limit and putting something in. But this time, what they did here and in a number of other places wasn't adequate. They didn't give people enough. And so people are really starting to become enraged and, at the state. Now, of course, there's some advantages here, and here's what's really interesting. You know, for global capital, having the state under assault is not that much of a problem. It's fine, because if the state's in trouble, no one is looking at global capital, which is the real system of governance. And so no one's looking at international corporations, for example, in terms of what the hell, why are they not, for example, just simply not collecting mortgages, not collecting rent, paying people their salaries, regardless of whether they're working or not. I mean, there's billions and billions and trillions of dollars available to do this. That global capital could simply make sure everyone stayed at home by providing free healthcare and providing a living wage for everyone through this crisis. And it wouldn't cost them but a fraction of their annual profit. And that conversation is not being had. Instead, everyone's getting mad at the governments. What the hell? Why aren't you guys? You know, of course, these governments have very limited tax base because corporations don't pay taxes, and people aren't working as much as they used to. So, I mean, yes, it's downloaded to the individual. Absolutely, I agree with you 100%. But for me, anyway, it's not the state that's an issue. It's the fact that no one, or I shouldn't say no one, very few people are speaking to the fact that global capital has contributed nothing to this effort. A few maps here and there, some media events, but in terms of actual material support, they could solve this problem tomorrow without much difficulty. But their indifference, going back to what you said, Faraz, earlier, their indifference to this, to living things, and their addiction to profit, and their need to hold on to their money, has made it impossible for them to respond reasonably.
And connected to that question, as you have mentioned about Trump, you know, if we think about global capitalism and its connection to, so two phenomena. If you think about Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, then you have Boris Johnson in UK, then you have Narendra Modi in India, you have Xi Jinping in China. So it's interesting, Duterte in Philippines, that there is a very fearful rise of the I'm just trying to navigate through liminality here, is that the very forceful that, I mean, there was a individual and person who mentioned about this, that I can't, I have no problems with free speech, but I can't guarantee your freedom after you give your speech. So that's a kind of reality. So if you look at Duterte or Jair Bolsonaro or Modi or Boris, how do you connect this to global capitalism? And as opposed to this, you have Trump and you have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So nobody, in my shallow knowledge of American history, you have seen from 60s, nobody has talked about as explicitly as about America's complicity with international violence. If we think about Rashid Tlaib, if we think about that way, and directly, even the Israel-Palestine relationship, how do you make sense of this as opposed to understanding the global capitalism as a phenomenon?
Well, I don't think that's opposed to. I mean, it is part of the global capitalist system, right? Which is that essentially what you've got is a feudal economy, But it's on an international level. And the overarching system is global capital, but global capital has no center and it has no particular leaders, right? It's not responsive to people. It's only responsive to money. So there are people embedded within it, of course, everywhere, but they don't actually have any control over it. None of even the major leaders of corporations have any real control over global capital. They're responsive to global capital. But global capital is a system of logic that exceeds anyone's individual involvement. So it's a global system, right, that is producing immense amounts of money. And there are people within it, but no one can steer it, no one can guide it. It's kind of just doing what it does. It's already outside of human control. Within that, however, there are fiefdoms that we used to call nation states. Well, we still do, but they're essentially fiefdoms, right? And they're run by little monarchs who are attempting to grab whatever piece of the pie they can. Russia wants a bit of it, China wants a bit of it, the United States wants a bit of it, Brazil wants a bit of it, right? And so, as with the old feudal system, of course, you have benevolent monarchs and you have dictatorial monarchs. And then you have, within that, you have the folks who are the next level down, who are what we used to call Congress. Well, we still call them Congress, but what they function like is more like, the folks who work directly under the king to grab whatever they can. It's complete corruption throughout it all. I mean, everyone's grabbing as much money as they possibly can and trying to grab as much at stakes as they possibly can. So they're no longer functioning as systems that are accountable to the people who live there any more than the monarchs during the feudal period did. They don't care what the peasants do. They're all about working within this broader global system to try to accrue as much as they possibly can, which is what politicians within the nation state, the old nation states, are trying to do, right? They don't really care about the people as long as the people don't overthrow them. And various mechanisms for attempting to keep that from happening. Everything from straight up dictatorships and rule, and of course the anxiety of it all, in terms of people suddenly feeling as though their world is no longer in any way, shape, or form predictable, leads people to sort of try to put people in charge who will say, "Look, it'll be predictable." The downside to that for those leaders is that they can't. They won't be able to make it predictable. And in order to keep it predictable, they're just going to have to jail and kill a lot of people in order to make it look like it's safe. And they'll have to blame it all on everyone else, of course, as Trump does, right? It's not him, it's everybody else, the leftists. And they're doing that all over the world, right? And then you have more benevolent leaders who, are still just as corrupt, but are, go out a bit more here and a bit more there, and at least say the right things. Now, people like Ocasio-Cortez, that's the next generation. They're interesting. The young people today are interesting because, yes, you're right. They are not getting the education in the schools, but they are getting educated on the internet. And they are probably the best educated group I've ever met in my life. I mean, activists particularly have access to all this information in ways that we never did, certainly, and probably your generation actually never did. The 15 and 16-year-olds, this is not a new world for them. This is the world they were born into. There's nothing new about it, nothing innovative about it. They're used to information being accessible at the drop of a hat. They know how to discern one source from another. They're very savvy politicians and very savvy activists. And that's going to be very interesting to see how that plays. As this older generation of despots and monarchs begins to die off, and you actually get people for whom this isn't a new system, but this is a system in which this is home for them. The virtuality is home for them. And one of the good things about that is that what's home to you, just like in your family, is that to which you are most familiar, but that against which you have the most information to rebel and to reform. Because it's yours. It's not outside of you. It's not new. It's not innovative. It's just what it is. And so this next few generations is very interesting, and they may change. It could change because they know the insides of how this system functions as a life, not as something new to them. And so I think that's very interesting and hopeful.
So now I'm going to refer to Carol Anderson, her book, White Rage. one of the things that, in that book, something very stood out for me is what was the participation in the political process in Mississippi, like, the place where 67% people are black, but in the local election, only 6% came out. Now, I'll connect it back to the immigrant community. So this is something, it's very, very close to my heart, and something that I'm planning to do my PhD on, understanding the identity negotiation and the political participation process. Now, if we think about the South Asian community, I'm not very familiar with the American scene, but I live in Toronto. I'm talking about that part of the so I'm speaking particularly to the community that I know very closely. Now, we as immigrants, and again, you have spoken to purity and righteousness, and I'm cognizant of that in a particular 2 points. Now, we are beneficiary of a long, long resistance put up by Black and Indigenous people. But at least for me, when I went to Canada, and I often give this example, this is particularly for me very educational, that somebody, the person who came to pick me up at the airport, I've never landed in Canada, I have no previous family or anybody there. The gentleman asked me, what do you think about Canada? And I answered to him that I think it's one of the most peaceful countries in the world. And that was my knowledge. And I have spent a lot of times being an educator and working for the marginalized youth in Bangladesh and so on. How radically my understanding changed in about 6 years. And I was baffled by my own depth of ignorance about the resistance about indigenous people, their systemic oppression. I was baffled by my ignorance about Black people. And obviously when I was in Bangladesh, I wasn't racialized. I became racialized when I started living in Canada, right? Me, victim of those sort of things, and as I sort of made me more conscious. I am particularly not very happy as a person looking at, if I look at the backdrop of Black Lives Matter and Idle No More, I don't think that we have mobilized the way actually we have been benefited. I think, and I'm sorry, it might offend some people. I'm talking purely about the South Asian mentality, that model minority myth. We have an attitude of slavish gratitude. When I went to Canada on scholarship studying for my postgraduate studies, I was happy, cloud nine, etc. But my own transformation of consciousness made me at times not very prudent in terms of navigating spaces, and I stepped into places that wasn't safe for me, as if the academic spaces are apolitical. But this is one of the neoliberal trick, is presenting academia to be objective. It's not political, as if there is no politics of knowledge production and dissemination. Now, I will connect it back to Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, 0.55% of the students go to British school system, where I have taught for a long time. In Bangladesh, you have the internationalization of education. You have schools like American International School and International School of Dhaka, where students pay tuition fees in dollar. Imagine, Hans, in a country like Bangladesh, where students pay about 37,000 US dollar annual tuition fees, and those schools' seats are filled. So imagine the disparity of education system. What has happened in COVID-19 pandemic? You see, those schools are running with fantastic internet speed and et cetera, as opposed to that, what I do passionately, and I spend, like even today, I've spent about 4 hours training the most marginalized educators of Bangladesh in the villages. Whoever has like one smartphone, and I love what you said, what you taught me, and stays with my heart, is that how do you find out that in a the vacuum, that space, the liminality, is that there's one smartphone, there are 3, 4, 5 teachers around that. We are talking, can we even at least use that kind of conference? Teachers don't know how to turn on the video or turn mute, but I see the places the possibility, and they kind of feel very inspired, like, okay, let's move on. So 99% students are from the other system, which is not British, but the privileged one, students coming from the wealthiest faction, they're the one where the education is very, and that has been my postgraduate research, is fundamentally colonial literacy practices in a post-colonial country. Now, What I'm trying to get three questions. First question, the attitude of slavish gratitude. I, as an educator, think it's a product of colonial literacy practices and, psychic colonization. And the moment we see, a white person, immediately we have that servitude, the subservient mentality is that, okay, this person is white, and that's it. So that's what I see. And we don't want to, we don't want to contradict when we live in space like Toronto. And obviously we buy into the myth of, oh, multicultural. We don't talk about it's a vertical mosaic, right? So that's one first question, is that, what is your observation about the attitude of slavish gratitude, and what could be some of this explosion that, exposes that myth? A. Second question, that literacy practices that, is fundamentally racist and colonial, that, the white man's burden, a person who was given Nobel Prize, it's very much alive and, practicing in Bangladesh. How do we connect it here? I am almost like, sometimes I speak and I feel like, out of trauma, I sometimes yell, and, I don't see, an easier way to deal with it. So the extension of literacy practices that started in Europe and coming to places like Bangladesh to the wealthiest faction, and hence permeating through the, entire structure. And the third part of the question is that what brings undoing the self for these two groups of people I have mentioned, and coming to spaces of solidarity?
All right, so let's start with the last and move towards the first. Well, no, yeah. So you're absolutely correct. I mean, Fanon talks about this as well, in terms of the subjectification of the colonial subject as a subject that is only produced in relation to whiteness. In other words, under a colonial context, one's only possibility of identity is in relation to the colonizer. Colonizer controls all aspects of life, or at least a huge percentage of the aspects of life. And so one becomes a subject that is responsive to. And that does very strange things to who one imagines oneself to be. Women, of course, have this in relation to men, the gay community, to the straight community, which is to say that everything that I am has to be in response to you and what you may or may not do, because I'm subaltern and I have to go through you to get to the things that I need. As a result of which, everything I do has to be translated through your vernacular, through your habits, through your speech, and if I violate those codes, then you can punish me. And so my subjectivity then is going to be produced in response to you. And my anger is going to be twofold. One, I'll have a murderous rage towards you, of course. But two, I'll also have a murderous rage towards myself for failing to negotiate the code successfully on an ongoing basis. I will resent myself. I will demean myself. I will belittle myself for my failures. Now, the one way to manage that, of course, is a re-indigenization. That is to say, to try to make some sort of return to who I was before we had this set of relations. Of course, that's highly suspect. I don't know how you go back to what you were before that, since that has intervened for hundreds of years now. And so it means resubjectifying oneself forward, which is, of course, the process that Idle No More and Black Lives Matter and any number of other movements, Palestinians, et cetera, and so forth around the world, African liberation movements in Bangladesh, et cetera, have attempted to do, which is to say, hey, what can we bring forward from our traditions and our culture that would allow us to produce ourselves as an alternative to the colonial project? And the post-colonial term, of course, is highly suspect. There are no post-colonial countries. There are only modes of colonial power that have shifted into something that isn't recognized as colonization. But we're not beyond colonization. We may have shifted governance structures and folks may have gone home, but it's not over by any stretch of the imagination. The mode and the who may have changed. So those two things are highly problematic, right, in terms of how colonized peoples, but also how colonizers reshape themselves in such a way as to have a more equitable set of relations. Of course, that does lead to a sense of servility just as a strategy for survival. But that also leads to, as you pointed out quite nicely, explosions of rage and resentment, because that's, of course, natural. One would do that unless one was so highly controlled as to erase oneself, which some people do. They simply erase themselves in public spaces, at least. Perhaps they've embittered themselves at home or within their family or within their community, but when they enter into the broader dominant culture, they simply erase themselves. They're simply not present, except as a reflection of the dominant structure that's gazing at them, in public at least. So that was two of the questions. You had a third. I'm sorry, I lost it.
And how these two groups, like for instance, when James Baldwin talks about, for another time, is which makes me hopeful that sometimes I yet don't understand, what kind of pain that I experience, is that James Baldwin is calling the white people his own forgotten little brothers, younger brothers. That is that how. Not by being rageful, not by being angry towards them, is actually not going to do anything. And when Toni Morrison says so brilliantly is that, the whole idea of creating the other is needed for, their own, to insert the whiteness, right? So the question is that how collectively, because, Fannie Lou Hamer is that no one is free until all is free, right? So if this is the situation where we live, how do we actually collectively that the emancipation of both at the same time,
Right.
Yeah.
You have two different projects in my mind, and I have this conversation with my Indigenous activist colleagues quite often. And they say, "Well, I don't really. Deleuze is really interesting, but I don't understand. Can you tell me how we might use Deleuze in our project?" And I would say to them, "You don't. It's not your project. Deleuze was not setting out to do anything for." To work for the project of indigenization or decolonial work. Deleuze's project is designed to undo European modes of identity and European modes that lead to inner fascism. And so there are two different projects here. I don't think if you're going to mount a project that is reliant on resubjectifying yourself outside of the colonial gaze, that undoing yourself or unontologizing yourself is a very smart move. I think that you really need to reconstitute a viable self outside capital, but you've already been undone. The colonial move has really worked quite hard to unontologize everything that comprises the colonial subject. And so I don't think, I think in a sense, the colonial subject is already, that work's been done in brutal, traumatizing ways that require a re-ontologizing outside of the capitalist or colonial gaze. And so that's a very different project with very different tools. And it's one of the reasons that in my own work, I don't use post-colonial authors or indigenous authors or anyone when I'm talking about the process of unontologizing settlers. Or undoing whiteness. That project for Europeans or descendants or inheritors of the legacy of colonialism, for us, yeah, we need to unontologize. We need to undo ourselves because the kind of subject that we are is a nasty, vicious, predatory. That kind of those tendencies in that particular subject are really dangerous, as you pointed out with all the world leaders that you just named that are recolonizing. So I think so. Two different projects, and I think they're very different projects. I think they're allied projects, and we can talk across projects. I think for me, as an older white cis male, fairly privileged as full professor, et cetera, and so forth, to tell one of my indigenous colleagues how they ought to decolonize stuff, or how it's not my project. I can respectfully talk about what the work I'm trying to do so that I can produce myself as someone who might vaguely be able to be an ally in that project. Um, but I have a lot of work to do first before I can be even close to safe. Because most, we talked about being a dry drunk before. In this sense, many allies are dry drunk white supremacists. They've got rid of all of the language, and they've got rid of many of the ruder practices, and they don't overtly steal shit from people. But they are still prone to being extremely traumatic in their relations with their allied brethren and sisters. They can cause a lot of pain unintentionally because they don't know the buttons they're pushing, and they don't know the levels of privilege they're asserting, and they don't know the space they're taking up. So, yeah.
So Ngugi, in his book, A Decolonizing Mind, he presents a very strange kind of dilemma for someone like me. So my project, my postgraduate project, at Brock, was basically looking at the colonial literacy practices in Bangladesh. Just a few days ago, there was an event in Bangladesh where a very brilliant, young girl, I think she's probably 10, 11 years old, she has mastered, she has, learned how to speak in British accent. And when she did, that video went viral, like, millions of people viewing and praising and et cetera. But what was interesting in that video, and I don't think, I appreciate that, young girls' talent to be the artistic capacity to, but I find it problematic is that, millions of people, and even like educators showering with these practices, like I have had experiences working in a technology company where I was talking to very high-end customers. One particular, white woman, I was talking to her, and she was telling me, I don't think you even speak English. I was explaining to her about a very intricate, technology, but the answer that I was giving was not something that she was looking for, right? Then I presented this matter to my superior. I don't think that actually gotten the due attention, So then I looked into an element of kind of research is called linguicism. One Stanford professor has done a lot of work, is that linguistic profiling. If you have seen recent movies called, it's about, I forgot exactly. Sorry for bothering you. It's a fantastic sociological movie that, in order to succeed, how I have to talk like a white person, or else, I will not be, successful. So Ngugi presents a problem for someone like me, is I am talking about epistemic violence in a place like Bangladesh that is till, today is very much present. But I'm writing in a language which is not mine.
Yeah.
I am writing to be accredited by colonial institutions. And if I happen to be working with scholars whose politics of scholarship is not aligned with mine. Now, if I compare with my Canadian white peers who were born and raised in that society, they have had a lot of insight knowledge that I didn't. Bourdieu talks about it a lot, cultural capital, social capital. I didn't have such social capital. I don't have cultural capital. I'm not an insider. So the transubstantiation of capital, that is from social and cultural to economic capital, I don't know. So if I want to understand the epistemic violence, and to some extent, in many ways, I agree with you, is that I don't know how, to go back, what has created layers and layers. But if I want to somehow, I want to find out a way to break that cycle of epistemic violence, I don't have any way in front of me. And, even the structure, the way it is actually doing is that the academia has presented to me the most viable and fruitful, avenue so far for me in many of the works I have done. You are a professor. You have supervised many students. You, as a white, privileged, cisgendered, male, and also an, highly, established academic, how do you look at it? How would you speak to your peer colleagues, to address such a strange and bizarre problem or dilemma? I wouldn't say problem, dilemma.
Okay, so I would have three responses.
Mhm.
First of all, um, I think that what the university offers is space to think and to articulate your thoughts. And with tenure, it offers you some protection so that you
Mhm.
can do that. At least for the time being, that's the case.
Mhm.
I don't think it offers um, non-colonial. I don't think it offers previously or even currently colonized subjects a home, and I think that needs to be clear. On the other hand, I remember being at a conference in Manchester, England, with a great many people from the global south who were being educated in Britain and around Europe, and some of us white privileged professors were bemoaning the ivory tower status of the university, and how problematic it was for colonized subjects to be in such an institution, only to have a unanimous and quite vocal response from those people saying, "You're out of your mind. This is the only place I can think safely in my life." Um, right? So, to the degree that the academy offers a place to think safely and to articulate, I wouldn't worry about who's reading you. I would worry about whether, it's not whether your community is reading you. Are you right to articulate, not to address? At least I write to articulate, not to address. I'm trying to think out loud, and writing offers a nice opportunity to do that and to articulate my project. To the degree that then you take that project into the world through your students or through your own activism, that's a separate part of your life. So your research, your writing, that's for the university offers you an opportunity a place to think with relative safety. That's not true for your PhD, by the way. That's after your PhD and after your tenure. Until then, you're in dangerous territory the whole distance. However, even once you're a professor, I mean, I'm a full professor, I'm still blacklisted any number of places for my radical ideas. Conferences won't have me, et cetera, and so forth. And colleagues, think I'm just way too radical, which is fine. It doesn't bother me, of course. But I think there's no safety, is what I'm saying.
Mhm.
In that sense, of course, I'm safe employment-wise, and I can say what I want. I still get published, et cetera, and so forth. But there are spaces that are still not safe, even for someone as privileged as myself. So it's a complex situation. But to be able to think and to write is not who you're addressing, is for your own thinking. Your activism and your work through your students towards their activism, that's another project that can be accomplished through the academy and through its connections.
Mhm.
So I don't know if that's helpful, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We have another question from Professor Zahir. Understanding neoliberalism as a discourse allows for a much more integral approach to social relations than speech performance alone. What do you think?
I would agree.
Mhm.
I think that the notion of discourse when it comes to neoliberalism is very helpful in terms of thinking about it as an articulation of, um, of the way that power relations function within capitalist society. Neoliberalism uh, defines and establishes those power relations through the way that it articulates itself in language, but also, of course, in media of all types and educational facilities, et cetera, and so forth. So discourse in the Freudian sense as an articulation of power relations embedded within certain linguistic formulations,
Mhm.
also symbolic formulations throughout society, is an extremely helpful way to think about neoliberalism. The limitation is that, I think, is that power relations shift when we get into the 21st century. And so the discursive analysis that looks for modes of oppression, for example, doesn't function the same way because neoliberal capitalism doesn't oppress in the same way. That's not what it does. It restrains and restricts, but through opening. In other words, it wants you to do more, think more, create more, and it wants to exploit all of that. It has very little interest in disciplining your body, for It really doesn't care unless you're going to go out there and throw Molotov cocktails or put your body on the street. It really doesn't care what you do with your time. It doesn't care who you sleep with. It doesn't really care. Matter of fact, it would prefer that you're a bit excessive because you're more likely to go to death. So its modes of control shift, and so our ways of understanding language works is a little different. It's not attempting to articulate the same subject of the interpolated subject, to use Althusser, as an oppressed subject. In a perverse sort of way, it really wants to reduce you so that it can exploit you better. It wants less restriction.
Yeah, we have our last question here. It's a little bigger, so let's take 30 seconds. And she's the question: when a day and age in technology, when it is most convenient and feasible to make university courses and credible information freely available over the internet yet to be realized, why isn't it happening already? Why isn't self-learning being promoted? Is it protect a job in teaching profession and keep the university business running? And another question connected to the same person is, we built a system where our theories, opinions, and outlook on life must align with that of the mainstream liberal nations, and any more that differs with the core modern system. What is the okay? All right. Yes, Hans.
Two really complicated questions. Can you post the first one again?
Yeah, sure. The first one is about
got it. So I don't think it's to protect jobs in the teaching profession or to keep the university running. I think that it is to certainly the ability for bots, for example, to reconfigure information on the internet is an attempt to corrupt everything that you're proposing. The reason that it's necessary to corrupt everything you're proposing is that what's out there, if it weren't corrupted, has actually radical and revolutionary potential for people to get information that they could use. To the degree you use bots and so forth to corrupt that information so that you don't know what's true and what's not true, what you can count on, what conspiracy theories are being floated today or tomorrow across social media platforms, is an attempt to make sure, or to attempt to make sure, that the information that people would connect to in terms of their own material actuality, what's really happening, that they could use for radical or revolutionary purposes, is diverted or corrupted. So that makes it much more difficult to be able to mount projects based on information, even though information is the currency of the age. And the reason I don't think that it's a problem for universities is because, for me as a professor, all of that stuff is great. I would love to have my students have all of that information. It needs far richer discourses, far richer capacity to understand things. I use social media and virtual stuff in my courses all the time. I use clips, I use access to media sources. I don't even use textbooks any longer. Everything that I use is connected virtually, so students don't have to buy books. I shouldn't say that. I probably should have. But I don't think it interferes with my version of university. I think it's problematic for the emerging neoliberal university who would prefer to restrict flows of information to specifically those things they want students to learn. So I think the reason it's not happening is specifically because it has so much possibility and so much potential for radical thinking and thought and critique. That's why, on the one hand, in the public sphere, it's being corrupted as quickly as possible, so that it's hard to figure out what's what. And in the university sphere, it's because it's restrained and restricted by things like the neoliberal focus on competencies, making sure you only learn certain things in the courses and you don't get too far outside the box. For people who are full professors like myself, that's not a problem. I can teach whatever I want. Protected. For instructors and for adjunct faculty and for untenured junior faculty, they're much more constrained and constricted by these emerging neoliberal platforms that keep them from actually being able to engage students in what I consider to be profoundly rich flow of information that I love to have my students have access to and to discuss. So that's the first thing. And then the second set. Oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we promote. This is a really complicated question. I've been thinking about it a lot. So I teach a course on cultural competence, quote unquote, which I hate the title of. But I prefer cultural humility. But what we tend to teach is symbolic diversity. That is, we tend to teach literate diversity or linguistic diversity. We tend to teach people that it's their fault individually that we have a racist, sexist, homophobic system. And so at university, most of the courses that engage diversity at all, which is not always done, number one, it should be taught in all courses because it relates to everything. But when we do it, we tend to do it symbolically and we tend to do it individually. That is to say, if you just change your language, if you're just nicer, if you interact with people in less rude ways, and if you understand that some nasty stuff went on in the past that we're trying to overcome now, then things will go well. So please remove all symbols linguistically or visually from your world that would cause other people discomfort. What we don't teach in any meaningful way is our complicity in systemic racism, systemic sexism. We don't teach the material actualities of the fact that settlers such as myself or people who are beneficiaries of the legacy of colonialism are still living on blood-soaked land and profiting off of the enslavement, brutality, rape, and torture of other human beings, and that continues today all over the world, and that we're continuing to live well on the basis of this, and that we're complicit, not individually, well, yes, for sure, we've none of us go past, but more importantly, our society is designed to run this way. In other words, a lot of people say, well, society's not functioning properly. It's not doing what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to be free and active. No, it's not. It is running precisely the way it is designed to run. It is designed as a racist, sexist, homophobic system. It is designed to other people. And it continues to systematically brutalize human beings on the basis of various categories. We shift the categories around periodically, and we give certain groups a pass now. And we allow certain numbers of them into the higher echelons of the economic system. But we're not serious about systemic change. We just want people to act in ways that don't kick up a whole lot of ruckus. And so the reason that we teach the kind of diversity that we're proposing is because we're not serious yet, or at least that's not to say all of us aren't serious. I certainly try to be serious. But as an institution, as the universities as an institution, we're not yet serious. We're like corporations. We want a 3-day training on racism, and then all the employees will now behave well, and we're over it. It's good. We're great. And we don't have to acknowledge the fact that my university is built on stolen land. My university sits on the blood-soaked land of enslaved people, right there where the university sits. There were slaves. Right there where the university sits, there used to be indigenous people. The fact that I have electricity is on the backs of people who are dying from pollution in communities where the plants are that generate the coal plants are that generate the electricity in my classroom. Those sorts of material actualities and expansions of ecological racism, the fact that, my international students might be barred from coming to the university next year because they may not meet whatever the current immigration nonsense is, or that I might have students whose relatives are being held in cages at the borders of the United States and ripped apart from their families, and I have students like this. Or that I have students who are living in communities in which people are shooting each other on a regular basis and the police are shooting them. I have students like that. And, we can have a course in which none of us ever talk about those things. That's terrifying. Or we can have a course in which we talk about racism, but we never talk about the fact that my student sitting in the third row had a father who was a crack addict and a mother who was a prostitute, and that was not because they were bad people, but because of the socioeconomic requirements of the neighborhood in which they live, which is still saturated with police marching through the streets shooting people. So we can never talk about that person's experience, but we can have a whole course on how we should never use these words and understand that. And yeah, we need to move beyond the symbolic and actually talk about the living experiences and phenomenological relations that we have with one another. And we have to take personal complicit responsibility. I had a person in a workshop many years ago that I gave on, I held. It was a group of many people from the community and workers in my agency, and we were going to talk about race. And so we were having a lovely conversation, and I was feeling really good about myself as the good white person in the room who brought this to be. You know, I was one of the good white people who actually had the courage to have this conversation. And so I was sitting there listening to everyone, you know, as they hashed this kind of stuff out and thinking, God, you know, patting myself on the back, what a great clinical director to have overcome these barriers, institutional otherwise, to get all these people in this room. We're going to overcome racism, damn it, right here today. And suddenly this girl from across the room, young black woman, looked me dead in the eye and said, "You will never understand this until you understand that your existence is personally painful to me." Yeah. And it took me about 3 months to process that. But I finally did understand that the fact that someone like me could exist by accident of birth and never have to wrestle with 90% of what she experiences on a daily basis, that my sheer existence is, in fact, that I could exist, is painful as a possibility that she doesn't share with me. Until we get that kind of stuff at a very visceral, personal level, the rest of it's lovely, and I'm not opposed to it. It's good stuff, but it's not going to get the work done.
Wow. I think you know John Clark from York University. He teaches a course there about social justice, and we have had 2 conversations with him. Wonderful, enlightening conversations, understanding, particularly, you know, from Bangladesh. When we think about Canada, like very few of us actually, we bluntly talk about our experiences. I don't think if I wasn't trained in social sciences, I don't think I would actually speak honestly about my experiences. We hide out of shame. You know, it's a land of milk and honey and all of that. So he talked about, you know, poverty in Canada and global capitalism. He talked about some of the programs, you know, in Jane and Finch area, and how we can take teachings out of the classroom to Jane and Finch. That really moved me. And one of the things that I'm trying to do is that in reaching out to global activists, writers, poets, professors, you know, to have very important and honest conversation. Dare I say, we're not allowed to have all this, you know, very honest conversation in neoliberal academia all the time. You know, we can be very, unfortunately, penalized for having this very honest and very needed conversation. And this conversation, obviously, we'll be using it for, we have talked to Hans about it, you know, for promoting critical literacy. We are creating a platform on Bangladesh. It's called Bangladesh Online Debate Society in the midst of this global pandemic, and understanding, you know, what's happening in the, you know, global north, what's happening in New York is connected to what's happening in Bangladesh. You know, it's connectedness. And then Hans, you have taken, you know, given us in almost 3 hours. You know, honestly, Hans, in our way of saying thank you very much, you know, for taking the time.
Pleasure.
And we will again reach out to you whenever, you know, you're, you know, able to, you know.
Yes, sir.
And something that deeply inspired me, the work of Ruth Wilson. One of the things, you know, that makes me, what I live now is not easy to live. Global pandemic and, you know, economic situation and everything, you know, the community where you work with, One of the things Ruth Wilson taught me, through her work, in academia and outside academia, and where she works in a place outside, in Portugal, in Portugal, a place outside, a community where, a community was getting taken over by a housing project. They'll make, big, expensive condo and all of that. People resisted there. They were told, you can go somewhere else, we'll make new houses for you, etc., etc. But what really deeply influenced me in a way, the people said there, we don't understand what is home. We don't understand what is home. So something that is deeply, deeply, again, a reality for Bangladesh is that many places are disappearing because of global climate change.
Sure.
So the question that bothers is that, what about the person who has never done anything to lose the little island where he lives? Will be gone tomorrow. Everything that she has experienced, lived memories, and everything will not be there. So there, I find the importance of having this brave, courageous conversation. You have talked about courage, very, very, eloquently, and that's one of the things that we talk about. Hans, thank you very much, for giving us the time, and and at least personally for me, you're a very inspiring educator. The things that I've learned, from you outside, the university campus over a cup of coffee, has really influenced a lot of the youth work that I do. So thank you, and dear audience, thank you very much for asking a very meaningful question and also being engaged with us. We will meet again. We'll continue to have this critical conversation. Have a great evening, and Hans, for you, it's daytime there, so have a lovely day.
And thanks to you.
Thank you. 1 second, Hans.